The first and only item on today's UDAAP schedule is the return of the master plan for Harbor Place. This is the second time they've come, and to UDAAP, and just to clarify that the design has not been modified, but the presentation has been modified to allow for the team to receive design feedback from the panel. So hopefully we can have a design discussion here and get some good feedback for the team as they move forward. So with that, I'll pass it to Pavlina.
Good morning, everybody. I don't have much to say yet, other than I'm excited to see you all back to delve deeper into the project and begin to discuss, study, and debate all of the proposals and wonderful work you've done to date. With me today, I want to introduce the rest of the panel, are Sharon Bradley, landscape architect, Kevin Storm, architect and planner, and Osborne Anthony, architect and planner. Without any further ado, please take it away.
Can you hear us?
Yes.
Good morning, and thank you for your time today, this morning. We are excited to be back with you to continue our discussions on the future of Harbor Place and the vision for Baltimore City and Harbor Place that we've come up with after a pretty lengthy engagement process. So we spent the last month since we were in front of this body working with the Department of Planning to ensure that this presentation is effective in communicating our vision. And I think we've all agreed that the summation of the panel's comments last time were to make sure that we were more detailed. And so we're going to go over who's on the team, how the community engagement impacted design and planning, the history and how it's honored, the design process and the thinking about how we arrived at the solutions, and talk about the pedestrian access, transit, multimodal, and the greater connection to the city. What we heard is we need more detail, and we're hoping that we can deliver that today. So we're going to talk about our team. Wait, hold on, what did you say now? Yeah, you're good. Okay, so we're talking about a team which is world-class professionals, which you see here, who are sitting around the table with us, and then also on the Zoom here, and we really think or really hope that the work that comes through from this team, which includes Gensler, Unknown Studios, STV, Traffic Group, Biohabitats, Moffett Nickel, Sutton Campbell and Brick, BCT Design, and 3XN Architects. We really hope that that comes through when you see what we were talking about in terms of the master plan. Before we get into that, I just want to touch on the community engagement again. It's important to note that this project started with some significant listening. We didn't really even engage the professionals to get started until this listening session got started. We spoke with tens of thousands of Baltimoreans. We heard from over 90 neighborhoods, and we, as I mentioned, didn't even get this team going until that process got started. So we have big meetings, we have small meetings. We created youth engagement by getting the youth involved with the Youth Works, the Mayor's Youth Works program. And we had lots of people engage with us through our website. And I just want to point out, I made sure this picture was in the slide, that last picture, we actually had signs on the sides of buses. The purpose of that being to make sure that people in Baltimore knew that we were seeking their input and engagement in our listening sessions. So we also met with all, tons of stakeholders downtown, as well as, other folks, community associations. You see some pictures here, some of the folks we met. It's really important for everyone to know here who's listening as well. All of these public engagement reports are available on our website. So you can go to ourharborplace.com and you can download the reports and you can see what people had to say about the project. Throughout the presentation, you'll see that we pulled quotes from the community engagement reports to sort of talk about what we think we pulled in and how that is reflected in the design. But obviously, when you read the community engagement reports, so this is important, you're not going to see everything that people ask for, because at the end of the day, it was up to this team and our project to decide the things that we thought would make sense and that we wanted to lean into. But what people said is certainly reflected in the reports. Now where we are is we see ourselves in the processes. First was listening. Now we've presented our ideas, and now we're in the process of hearing back from people, getting feedback, which is coming in all kinds of ways, digitally, in additional community sessions. So there's lots of us listening again to what people have to say, good, bad, and indifferent about the initial plans we presented, including we've had meetings at the Federation for the Blind, the Science Center, Middle Branch Rec Center, and there's more to come. I think I even have one today. Okay, so what I just want to talk about briefly before handing it off to Vaki is the primary pillars of the development, which we believe are reflected in these plans, but obviously this is, part of the conversation today. So the first is building for economic sustainability. And what that means from MCB's perspective is we want a project that is financially feasible and that will be able to be sustained economically in the years to come. Embracing connectivity with the water. We believe that the current buildings as they sit serve as walls blocking the water, and we wanted to make sure that a project that we came up with would provide more access, more connectivity to the water, given that the water is effectively the primary anchor for this project and the surrounding assets. Accessibility, making it accessible. We heard this from many of the community groups that we met with, particularly senior citizens and people with families. Crossing those streets can be a little scary. How do people get there and enjoy it and get home? Keeping it local. This is less of a design issue and more of an issue of making sure that the long-term use of this project highlights what's best about Baltimore, which will make it a place that people want to come back to again and again. Designing for resilience. We have to deal with global warming. It's a fact we have to face. It's, Harbor Place already floods as it sits. The promenade does, and without making certain adjustments, it's very unlikely. It's very likely to continue doing that. Making it safe and welcoming. This is about public safety and a sense of public safety, which we think again is more of an operational issue, but it's something that people from Baltimore are very focused on, and we think that that aspect of it is best served by creating an environment which truly is as 24/7 of an environment as we could make it with the mixed use. And then the last thing, building equitably. As I've said in other presentations, this can be somewhat of a buzzword, but the way we're thinking about, equity in this instance is we're very focused on making this a place that's clearly not exclusive, and that there's, obviously there's beautiful public spaces which we want to enhance, but on top of that, we're looking for the architecture to be inviting, to encourage people to come in and interact with the commercial space that we are proposing here. So with that, I will turn it over to Vaki so he can get into the actual design presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Sorry, there's an echo. I don't know if anybody else is hearing that echo, if it's just me. Okay, well, thanks, David. Thank you, Pavlina. Thank you, Ren. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be back. Um, as David said, you know, these pillars were not only significant in the fact that they were built as a result of the community engagement process and the collaboration with the ownership team, but for us, for the whole design team, these really became the design drivers for us. Um, and so you'll see as we go through the content that we tried to, as best we could, stay true to delivering on each one of these design drivers, these pillars through design. And I really hope that, you know, through this process, if you have questions regarding any one of these pillars and how we may have attempted to realize it in the design, that you can, you know, please go ahead and ask specifically, and we'll do our best to answer that, okay? If you can advance to the next slide, please. So before we got into any design, we really took a step back and tried to have a conversation, not just with the group, community group, but even amongst ourselves about the significance of the project. We all know Harbor Place is right at the sort of apex of the Inner Harbor experience. We're aware of that. We understand its visibility, but we also know that it is also part of a long 8-mile promenade experience, an Inner Harbor waterfront experience. That's really one set of experiences amongst a number of other experiences. So thinking about this all as to, you know, whatever we do at Harbor Place, how does it add to the texture, to the experience of the overall Inner Harbor? That was also part of our thinking. And you can see the quote there in the top right about how even in the community group, people were talking about Harbor Place in context, the whole context from, you know, how does it connect the whole Inner Harbor? So next slide, please. So some of our research and inspiration included, if you could just advance, please, trying to understand what's already been done. And we know we've uncovered, of course, amongst other studies, 4 significant studies, the 2.0, the Baltimore Inner Harbor 2.0 study, the Pratt Street study of 2008, the Sustainability Plan of 2019, and the Complete Streets Plan of 21. We've scrutinized these plans, and we tried to kind of pull from them what we thought was the most significant content that we could leverage. All of them had amazing, useful information, but some of that that we sort of synthesized is captured on the left there in conjunction with what we heard from the public stakeholder group. One of the most significant ones, interestingly, was this idea of having no guardrails at the waterfront being a major part of what shapes the experience of our connectivity to the water, and that we want to have that remain. Of course, the Calvert Street swoop, that need not be beaten one more time. We all know nobody wants it in the city. This idea of connecting both visually and experientially to the waterfront. Of course, open space, parks, etc. The idea, of course, of shade and urban trees being important. Traffic calming. And I won't go down the rest of the list there, but you can see that there's a lot of summary information there that will be leveraged in the design. We also did a pretty exhaustive study of a number of global cities. On screen here are 18, but there were many more, including Washington, D.C., just down the road, where we looked at how did they do waterfront successfully and what are the strategies that they used. And we sort of looked at it from 3 lenses. The first one is development. And I think we're just highlighting Toronto here because we think that in terms of development, the idea of adding density on the waterfront, how it's done, how it's organized perpendicular to the water to preserve views, how you step, you know, and shape the skyline with the relationship to the water, and the idea that the ground plane remains as accessible as possible to enhance that connective tissue from the waterfront into the urban environment. The next lens that we looked at a number of sites through the lens of activation. Who did a great job of activating their waterfront? And Copenhagen in Denmark has done an extraordinary job, and you'll see some of these ideas start to layer into our plan as well. Really about how do you use your natural resource, not just as something to enjoy and look at, but also something to experience. How does it tie into a resilience strategy, which was the third lens that we started to talk about. And here, the highlight is in Hamburg, Germany. And really, this is about, you know, I think with regard to our promenade experience, the connective tissue that ties together the experience, the idea that this is a reclaimed industrial environment, and that there are many, many resiliency measures, including this idea of the upper and lower promenade, that were integrated to support the idea of ongoing resilience over time. So with all of that, and as you can tell, that is summary content. It goes quite deep. But with all of that, really what we were left with was asking ourselves, what would be our uniquely Baltimore approach? What's that kind of memorable idea that we can start to create here? And just all you have to do is look at these photographs, and you can tell that the idea of a working waterfront, a place of commerce at the urban edge with the water, is a significant driver to the experience. And that somehow, with the current iteration of Harbor Place over time, seems to have been lost in its most robust form. The materiality, all one needs to do is just look at what, the materials that signify most of older Baltimore, the use of wood, brick, and so forth. That we think that there's a place for that in the future. But I think most importantly is to enhance the idea of the authentic connection between our city and our water through this place. Next slide, please. So with those thoughts in mind, what we started to do was dream a little bit together. And just say, okay, well, maybe there's a couple of ideas that could become this sort of image shaping waterfront idea. So the first one was the idea of big shade. And, the reason this is important is we wanted this idea of character, the waterfront character, to be a central shaping idea for how we approach the design of Harbor Place and the Inner Harbor. So Big Shade was really about, can we deliver on this idea of creating an amazing oasis, a shaded downtown waterfront right at the city's edge, where Pratt & Light would be, you'd almost just arrive at this place that's lush and that's balanced with water, such a great natural experience, and also a place for diverse natural habitat to thrive. The next one was the idea of big water. Historically, this idea of the adjacency of water right at the intersection of commerce. In other words, Light and Pratt, the commercial streets. Is that even something that we could aspire to bring back? Harbor Place today sort of built into the water more and more, so that relationship has been lost. But what role does water have in shaping the experience of what a Baltimore waterfront should be? And we think that that's quite significant. The next one is this idea of a marsh garden city. And so again, this is related to the first one around shade, but this is more about the natural habitat, perhaps that, could we sort of recall what might have naturally occurred here more deliberately? Could we use this as an opportunity to reintegrate some of that natural native habitat and greenscape, this marshland, and really sort of bring that environment back? What role does that have? And so you'll see that these three ideas that I've just walked through in the future, as we went through this, they all sort of started to come together to shape our overall approach. Let's talk a little bit about our site and the existing conditions and what we're dealing with here. So before we jump into that, I just wanted to kind of set some context. What you're looking at here is actually the final site plan of our site, and so you'll see how the existing conditions kind of landed here. So I'll just quickly go through from that site plan and the buildings and how they landed, the final design buildings, and what are shown in sort of the red and purple colors underneath that are lighter. And then we've overlaid the existing two pavilions as well as the Calvert Street swoop over top of that, so you can see the relationship here. So what you have is the Pratt Street and Light Street pavilions that, as you can see, don't conform to the urban grid, as you can see. They currently cover the footprint of multiple buildings that we would otherwise propose. And of course, the swoop itself, again, also is quite, it changes the character of the urban grid. So if you go to the next slide here, what I also wanted to do is just show you guys the actual project site itself, so we can just define that more clearly. What's described as project area with the hash hashed area includes, of course, the 2 pavilions, but it includes this area that is right at the water's edge, going all the way from the aquarium and along the promenade, effectively to the rusty scupper. So that is the actual project area. There's an area of design focus, which we'll be kind of zeroing in on, which was captured a moment ago in the overall master plan, or overall site plan, I should say. But then there's also broader, because we understand that this include, some of the changes we're making to the traffic and so forth are going to have a broader impact. So we call that broader area the study area, and that goes even beyond some of what's shown on screen here. There are parallel traffic studies happening to understand the overall impacts of what we are proposing. So we are aware of all of those impacts. Next slide. One of the comments we had actually heard in our community engagement process here was around character. And of course, it was described in layperson speak, but for us as designers, when we talk about character, a lot of it has to do with the function, the use, the programs that happen on these streets. So starting with the 2 streets that really circumscribe our space here, Pratt and Light. Pratt Street, as everybody knows, that is our formal, let's call it our commercial street. That is the character of Pratt Street. It is very formal, it's ceremonial, it's celebratory, but it is very commercial in nature. And you see on the image on the right, the commercial uses are in the shades of blue, the lighter blue and the darker blue, the darker being the convention center, the lighter being more commercial office uses. It's very much the sort of central business street of Baltimore. Contrast that with the character of Light Street, which is on the next page. And you'll see a different color start to show up here. It's a combination of the orange color and the sort of purplish color. The orange is residential use, and the sort of purplish color is more hospitality, hotel use. So the residential makes all the sense in the world, right? Light Street goes north-south and ends up connecting you into Federal Hill and the residential communities that are south of our site as you go in that direction. So you can see that there is already a very strong shaping narrative around what uses are characteristically organized where. And this idea will come back to as we start to think about how programs lives within the site of Harbor Place itself. We also saw that, in our analysis that, we have in Baltimore so much space, ground plane space relative to other global cities. And to us, that equals opportunity. And what I mean by that is if you take a look at the sketches that are on the right-hand side there, that section through Light Street shows 482 feet from the water's edge all the way to the western side of Light Street. Contrast that, that with streets in Lyon, in Toronto, and in Vancouver, and you'll see that there's so much more opportunity for us to shape the experience there. But the unfortunate part is that in Baltimore, most of that, or a good chunk of that space, is taken up by vehicular lanes. And so it really runs opposite to what we want in terms of an experience of our water's edge in our downtown. And so we started to think about what should the right size of that vehicular width be relative to the opportunity of the horizontal space that we have. And this section here really does a great job of showing the upper section is the existing section through Pratt Street, and you can see there the 5 lanes, the 4 lanes of vehicular traffic plus the bus lane, and then of course the substantial sidewalk plaza that we would be proposing what's shown below that, which is really to sort of narrow up some of these traffic lanes. Of course, the addition of shade and trees, the addition of a very, very purposeful and deliberate shared use lane, and then of course the surface area that would be created that would replace the Pratt Street Pavilion for development, so that the proportion of what's shown in that cross section is much better. The scale of it is more humane, and of course it allows for a better experience. We did a similar section here for Light Street, and Light Street is an even more egregious situation where you have up to nine vehicular lanes plus a large median So very, very, very heavy vehicular experience there. And you can see the contrast of what we would be proposing down below, which is to cut that down to 4, 2 in each direction. Of course, again, the shaded environments, medians, etc., with the very well curated shared use path there. And then, of course, the development parcel shown sort of in place of the Light Street Pavilion today. If you were to walk to the site today, I think the most consistent part of your experience is navigating traffic. And those areas of high risk are shown in the sort of circle, the areas that are described with the orange circles there. These are all places you need to watch out because you could literally die. Traffic is so significant and moves so quickly. The other part of this experience that we saw, as shown on this, well, it's okay, you can keep going, as shown on this image right here, is of course, you can't see the water. You can barely see the water when you're standing on either Light Street or Pratt Street, which is a really unfortunate part of what we have today. This view here is taken looking on South Street, looking south toward the water, and you can see you're looking at the back of the Pratt Street Pavilion, and you might as well be, you know, in some other city because there's no connection to the water whatsoever. So let's move on to some of the planning strategies that we proposed. Next slide, please.
Good morning, I'm Claire Aubrey. I'm one of the founders of Unknown Studio and a landscape architect. So I'm going to take it from Vaki for a moment and talk about how did we fold all of that blue sky thinking and rigorous research into something that's pragmatic and doable. So when we were looking at those sort of waterfront character ideas at the beginning, we were sort of unencumbered by reality. Then we really started to get real. So this first slide is talking about the existing infrastructure and testing feasibility. So just a few things to note here. The cross-section is actually quite complex at the waterfront, and we wanted to work within the realm of reasonability and constructability when we thought about that waterfront edge. Perhaps the most important one to look at is this low left image. You see our existing promenade, which is 30 to 45 feet in dimension. What is not apparent when you're walking along that promenade is that about 30 feet on the water side is on piles, and then behind that we have the seawall and terra firma. So you also see that in the exhibit. We're working within those parameters to make sure we're not trying to kind of create something that is unbuildable or would take 50 years. We want to get this done. The other thing we're looking at very carefully are all the existing outfalls and the stormwater infrastructure, which you see in blue. These are significant size pieces of utility infrastructure, so we're working within those as well. So staying within those footprints, which you see here in the section also, is going to help us actually navigate permits and get this built in a more expedient way. We also want to we don't want to build out into the water further than we have to. As Vaki was saying, that's been the kind of historic trajectory of losing water as the city has built out into it. So here is an existing waterfront section. Sorry, if you just go back 1 second. I just want to note that the existing promenade ranges from about 30 to 45 feet. We are always enlarging that in the proposal, and we'll show you a little bit how that works. We're also changing grades, and what's most important here is to understand that we've got about 30 feet of relieving platform. We're really going to play with that zone where it's on piles today. And then behind that is landfill. Most of that was built during the Great Fire and subsequent to that. So my favorite quote about resiliency and climate change is Niels Bohr, the Nobel laureate, who said, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. But we do have really good data. And working with Moffitt Nickel, they ran a scenario model. There's over 1 million data points in this, looking at the kind of lowest projection of sea level rise and storm surge and warming to the highest. So with this probability model, we were able to test a range of scenarios from the worst possible case to the rosiest case, and really start a conversation not about solving a problem, but about what is the acceptable level of risk for this program, for this site. And as always happens in my business, we got a major flood right in the middle of design. So we were all down there looking at what was going on in early January, an unseasonable storm that took us to about 7.25 feet above sea level rise. So we worked together with the planning department to confirm some of our assumptions. And not to get too detailed about this, really where we landed was to define an acceptable level of risk for the promenade and the first floor elevations for redevelopment at Harbor Place. And the main point that you need to take away from this slide, the existing promenade is at about 6. We have a likelihood of flooding each year of about 1.8%. We are proposing lifting the promenade to the 9 to 10 foot, and that is going to put us at an equal or less than level of risk than we have today. So we feel good about that, and that's been something that we've been in dialogue with Planning Department about as well. So lessening our risk. It also opens up a huge opportunity for thinking about what else can we do. We don't want to just solve this in a kind of engineering sense and lose choice and vibrancy and vitality on the waterfront. So we want to kind of deliver that resilient layer, but we also want this to be adaptive, meaning it can change over the next 50, 7,500 years and adapt to sea level rise. And then very, very critically for this team, we want it to be accessible. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. So in cross-section here, we've worked within those existing footprints and coverages, and we've done a number of things which are directly related to the pillars and the public engagement. We have maximized the green, so you see on the left side of this. In many cases, we've widened the promenade, sometimes up to 60 foot, and we've raised that upper promenade, what we're calling the upper promenade. That does a number of things. It gives us that resiliency measure. So the upper promenade and the first floor elevations are usually at plus 9.5 to 10. It allows us to bring new soil volume in so we can really create a healthy, vibrant canopy so that we're not torturing our trees over the next decade. It gives us prospect and proximity to the water. And then we've introduced a new typology, which is a lower promenade, which varies between fixed and floating. And that gives us adaptation. So that floating promenade will go up and down with the tides and the floods, and it also gives folks a chance to get right to the water. That's something that's so important, as Vaki introduced at the beginning. So in summary, a bit more of a technical drawing here. We have a really amazing benefit of this site in that it's floodplain and it's flat. So getting from Pratt and Light to the waterfront at a nice, easy 2% grade is quite easy. So that's what you're seeing in the kind of primary grading on the plan. And then in section, you see what that looks like, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. Going from stairs and barriers and the existing condition and a kind of fixed promenade, in some ways one-dimensional experientially, to something that's variable and can change with the seasons and has these different choices between upper and lower. So here you see the summary of all of that, and I understand there's quite a lot of complexity in the resiliency and the modeling, but the major takeaway here is that we're delivering something resilient, adaptive. It has more capacity than we have today. That's important because Baltimore's best days are ahead. We want to make sure that we can get all the people down here on the waterfront, and we have this multi-tiered promenade. So looking at 9.5 to 10, right at the redevelopment level with beautiful shade trees like we saw in Lyon and Rome and some of those international examples. We have barrier-free access down to mid-level promenades and fixed promenades, and then finally floating promenades with great proximity to the water. And not to forget, you're seeing here all these beautiful little green moments in this section. That's an opportunity to incorporate habitat value and water quality improvements in every little piece that we build.
Claire,
so just talk about a few of the places. The upper promenade, the plan in the section.
Claire, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. I appreciate, I just have a quick question if you can come back. It's important just so we can understand the rest of it clearly. It's the comparison between this drawing and the previous one. So the previous one was showing the new promenade is at 10, and it's like what you said, like this flat, barrier-free experience. And then there's the floating one, which varies. And then when you go to this next slide, where is the edge of the new bulkhead? It appears that there is stepping in that upper promenade, that there's the 10, but then there's still an intermediate height. So that is, so can you relate the two slides? I just want to make sure that we're reading everything cohesively and we continue to follow you as you go.
Yes, so if you just go back one, bulkhead stays the same. Now the bulkhead may require repair. It's past its engineered life, but we're not moving the bulkhead. So when you see these sections, you see that we are extending it vertically in the, correct. So in plan, we stay the same, and then vertically we'll be extending the bulkhead up to make that plus 10. This axonometric, Pavlina, it's a really good question. It shows a kind of summary of conditions. So this is no particular place, although sort of over by the World Trade Center. But the bulkhead where you see the yellow go to piles, that's our typical bulkhead condition. And then we have this, you're seeing this kind of step down and ramp down. We see that at the Pratt and Light Junction, and we see that also in front of the Pratt Street Pavilion. And then in other places, we will just have the floating dock. So when we go to the plan, I'll flag that again. It's never one condition. And I think that's important because we want to give choices and make sure it's the right promenade condition for the right location.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. So maybe we'll go a little more site specific here. This shows one of those conditions. So here we don't have the step down. We simply have the upper promenade, this beautiful view, and then we have the lower floating dock, which you see in the plan. There's a series of gangways, which will show that get you down to the lower promenade. There's a lot of things happening in these drawings, and we think that's good. It's very rich. It's not a kind of silver bullet design. It's something that offers choices and something for everybody. But most importantly, more space, more shade, preserving the views to the water, guardrail-free proximity to the water, and then something that people don't, some folks on this call I know are incredibly passionate about, but often overlooked is seating, how important it is to have benches and places to stop. And we've looked at universal accessibility with our seating. So we have backed and handrail benches. We also have backless benches. So lots of places for people to stop and linger. Then on the lower promenade, this is then moving to the right of the plan in this kind of prototypical condition on light. We have this, we've shifted the lower promenade dock into the water 10 feet. So we have the same coverage as we have today, but that's given us this sliver of water between the seawall and the dock. And that's important for habitat value, for allowing the stormwater outfalls to release in that area, and also to create no hazard at the bulkhead and the seawall edge. So just like today, there's no guardrail needed. Water is the condition just next to the upper promenade, and that gives us also the views. So here's a little more detail. Just like today, we have a guardrail-free upper promenade, however, now with beautiful shade trees, seating, wider capacity, and then new to the Inner Harbor will be these lower level floating docks. Nice wide capacity, so we're showing 25 feet of open, universally accessible dock, the ability to pull up boats and vessels just like today, and then we've incorporated seating and floating wetlands into these structures. So we're looking straight back up to kind of St. Paul Street, Calvert here. I'm going to move to a really important space in the project, the park at Freedom's Port. So Vaki introduced the fact that we're not the first to suggest removing the sweep. That's been in multiple plans, 2.0, that Pratt Street competition. We think it's a fabulous idea and should absolutely happen. This is a nice little drawing because it shows the overlay of that area over the historic marsh littoral zone of the waterfront. So what you're seeing in green on that image on the right is where the old shoreline was. And it wasn't deep water, it was marsh or some sort of riparian zone. So this is really interesting to us to think about what would happen if we take a new idea, which is making that place green. Some of the prior studies looked at making them very ceremonial or civic. We said, what if, like the sketch on the left, this becomes about recontextualizing some of the important historic landmarks. So the Constellation, which is an historic landmark, that viewshed is maintained, but then we kind of bring the green and pay homage to the historic ecosystem that was here. A few other things the park is doing now that we have over an acre and a half to play with here. By removing the sweep, we can do a lot in that amount of space downtown. So we're working with topography and planting to create a sense of enclosure. This is one of the busiest intersections in our city, but in using those tools and introducing water, we're able to create a kind of sense of serenity and an oasis and a place that really feels very comfortable as a human, unlike the McKeldin Square condition of today, which is very hot and exposed. So we've done that through materiality and planting. Now program, there's sort of two major layers here, really three. When Vaki showed those early ideas of bringing water closer to the city, those are really fun and interesting ideas, but the idea of actually digging a canal or moving bulkhead back into the city is not feasible or something anybody here has the stomach to pursue. That doesn't mean we can't bring water closer to the city. So you see this sort of undulating water feature, which recontextualizes the constellation, and that takes us all the way back to that important intersection. This is just a universal human magnet. People love having a water feature. And then we're able to overlay it with a space for contemplation, for serenity. Dale's going to talk a little bit more about history here in a second. We think there's a really important program here of making space for memorial and interpretation and education. This isn't just a plaque. This is creating a serene space surrounded by landform and trees with water down the center. And then lastly, this space is quite large. We've talked about increasing capacity. It can effortlessly toggle right into a very kind of democratic, flexible ground plane. When the World Series, when we have Fleet Week, folks can come and you can see there's about 3,000 people shown in this program, and you can see all the different programs kind of layered up: open plaza, softscape, shade, commercial, promenade.
Thank you, Claire, for bringing the uniqueness rather of the park and support the gateway to Harbor Place. We're going to quote a comment from the fall report. Quote, "There should be a memorial to those Africans enslaved in Baltimore whose labor and intellect built the primary wealth of the city and state," end quote. Harbor Place has been a Baltimore invention. It drew more than the tourists at Disneyland in the first year. Persons from all around the world came to learn and see this place. Today's changing face of America's urban landscape presents a new opportunity for a revolutionary concept to be reshaped. Set to reestablish a long forgotten history and uplift Baltimore City, the reshaping of Harbor Place is seeking to amplify the overlooked history and significance, particularly in reference to Freedom's Port, the 1790s free African-American community of Baltimore, which was one of the nation's largest population of free blacks during the antebellum slavery. Baltimore's early free black population concentrated around Harbor and Fells Point, close to shipyards, docks, and warehouses, where they found work in the region's booming maritime economy. The Baltimore slave trade, where an estimated 30,000 people were sold from Baltimore and its slave port, giving rise to the colloquial name of Pratt Street as the Trail of Tears, where slave dealers and slave pens lined this former street, and the founding location of Maryland's flagship historically black college and university, Morgan State University, originally at Sharp and Pratt Street in 1867. Harbor Place is steeped in history and has a significant legacy as a unique hub associated with the contributions of African Americans in the shaping of Baltimore, including countless number of unskilled and skilled laborers, free and enslaved, and peripheral tradesmen that worked on the harbor. In addition, some of America's most consequential African Americans and cultural institutions are linked to the place, such as Harriet Tubman, who conducted Underground Railroad activities at Dungan's Wharf, Frederick Douglass, who became a freedom seeker in 1838 in Baltimore, and the U.S. Constellation, which was a flagship of the African Squadron, which was used to suppress the slave trade along the west coast of Africa, was moved right here to the Inner Harbor in 1968. Since its erasure, there has been no prominent move to bring the history and significance of Baltimore's Freedom Port to the forefront of the public consciousness. This park at Freedom's Port as a memorial enables this story to be told through the immersive landscape, through future programming, monuments, interpretive panels at this gateway of Harbor Place. One of the most important areas of Harbor Place and its redevelopment is being dedicated as a public park and an extension of the water's edge. This is an opportunity through the power of design and history to create an authentic, world-class cultural heritage experience dedicated to both placemaking and place knowing.
Thanks, Dale. So I like that last
Is
image
this
because it
Dale
sort of shows
Green?
the dignity.
Is this Mr. Dale Green, Professor Dale Green? Hello?
I couldn't hear you. Hello? Yes.
Hello? Is this Professor Dale Green?
Yes, good to see you and hear you as well.
Good to hear you. Please introduce yourselves. We don't see who else is in the room, and it's a very small image of people sitting around table. It's so great to hear from you, and thank you for this great piece of information. And can we pause for a minute and consider? So, does this mean that this park, outdoor place, is indeed proposed as a memorial? Is there a commitment in that direction? Can we hear a little bit more about, this idea?
Yeah, so the idea is that this particular location, as you're seeing, is being proposed to become the feature public park named in honor of Baltimore's Freedom Port, and thus will serve as a memorial to that lost, buried, and obscured history. And as part of future programming and future development, there will be immersive experiences that will be developed at this location.
Okay, understood. So it's no longer McKeldin related or anything like that.
Correct.
It's seeking to express sort of and uncover the history of the place. Understood. Thank you so much for the clarity.
So we're going to move on to the last kind of, and this has gotten a lot of attention, component of the public realm on the waterfront. I'll just stop on this image for just one moment, Pavlina, to point to, you see there's two kinds of lower promenade, that's the darker brown. When you see a kind of sliver of water on Light and Pratt between promenade and land, that's that typical floating lower dock. Thanks, Adam, panning. And then when you see it kind of wrap the crescent where we have the park, where it's contiguous with the upper promenade, that's where it's its fixed condition. So it's allowing it to both float and move with the tides, and also have a few places that are fixed, more amphitheater style. So that's speaking to that axonometric you asked a question about. But to speak to this drawing, this is a really exciting part of the project, and one that has gotten a lot of public attention. When we showed images of floating docks in Copenhagen and swimming around the world, we got a huge response during public engagement. And this isn't new for Baltimore. The image in the lower right, we see, I think this is off of Dundalk. People used to swim in the water in Baltimore. And then the lower left, we know that there's an incredible initiative and a lot of enthusiasm around the water quality and doing that once again. So this isn't just a kind of playful incorporation. This is about activation and kind of bringing back our tie to the water and our immersion into the water for swimming and boating. So that's what this image shows. We have a number of programs on these floating docks. We have the ability to swim and get in the water, the idea of a kind of small kayak boathouse, which allows folks to come down, have a drink on the water, go boating, and then also incorporating floating wetlands and a lot of habitat value. So this is doing a lot. It's providing a lot of excitement, but more importantly, just like the mixed use, it's bringing vitality and activation and something for folks to do 24/7 at the waterfront.
Great, thanks, Claire. And so we've talked a fair amount here about planning. We've talked a fair amount about the planning related to this overall site and the waterfront and the edge, some of the street reconfigurations. What we want to do is talk a little bit about how we advance that planning to set up how buildings might start to interact with this site. So some of that sort of foundational rigor really was driven a lot by this idea of we have to connect people to the water at every opportunity, as many opportunities as we can. The urban grid allows us that through access, physical access, view lines, etc. So we started to kind of just extend the urban grid, and you can see with the dashed black lines for the existing pavilions how those really obstruct the natural organic extension of our city to the waterfront in relationship to it, as well as the swoop there, Calvert Street swoop. So if you really just extend the urban grid to the water, what you find is the site starts to sort of solve itself as to where construction should be and should not be. And that's what's shown in the sort of bluish green, is areas where you could possibly build and where you probably should rethink about whether you should or not, which is the white with the orange dashed arrows in there. So this was kind of the simple, very sort of obvious, intuitive approach to how to set up a framework. So we'll build on this as we go to the next slide here. The other thing, is when you start to put massing on these blocks, this page here is just to show you we did hundreds, maybe I don't know, thousands, but hundreds of iterations as massing studies, and we'll just zero into kind of how we sort of organize why certain masses are where they are, why a program is where it is, and this page that's now on screen here really starts to set that up. You'll recall I introduced the idea of street character with Light and Pratt. The blue arrow that's going east-west on the page is representative of the character of Pratt Street, which is more commercial and office uses. The orange going north-south is representative of the residential and hospitality uses that connect all the way into Federal Hill. So in distributing program, where should an office use be? It makes the most sense that it should support the character of Pratt Street. And so we found an opportunity with the sort of circular blue ovular shape off of Pratt Street. And if we do want to have a residential use, which we do, of course, it makes sense on Light Street, which is the orange ovular use. And you can see the image on the bottom left. As we talk through the sketch on the right, the image on the left will support in terms of massing. Okay, next slide, please. You just heard Professor Green and Claire speak about the park experience. We knew from the start that we wanted to deliver on a spectacular public park. We wanted it to be at the corner of Light and Pratt because we knew it would be an impact moment, it would be a human scale moment, it would be a surprise, and it would be really, really welcome. So that's the green circle that's shown there. The obvious entry front door to the site is at the intersection of Light and Pratt, hence the large black arrow right there. And you can see again on the bottom left how the site is starting to shape up according to this. If you continue to advance the slides, the next thing really is around culture. And also you also heard Dave talk about how we want this waterfront to have this memorable, iconic character to it. That Pratt Street being that ceremonial street is the right place to have such a moment occur. So in combination with the park, something that would occupy that space with the large red oval, which eventually became the Sail building that was designed by our partners 3XN. This all seemed to just make really intuitive sense. Within the corner park itself, the Park at Freedom's Port, if we were going to have some kind of pavilion or some kind of activating function, it seemed to make the most sense where the small red oval is shown. Also because it supports this idea of the extension of Camden Street, which was one of those arrows that we showed you in a slide prior. So this is kind of how we approach the distribution of program on the site. And so the bottom left of this image that's on screen is where we landed with the volumetric distribution of program before, of course, the architecture was designed. But you're seeing also on the right-hand side a number of iterations on these same ideas, but starting to speak to the shaping of where height feels like it wants to be if the front door, the deliberate front door of our site, the ceremonial front door, is at the corner of Light and Pratt. The height of the building seemed to want to step away from that moment so that you can get that density, for example, what we saw in Toronto, but still have a human scale. And I think the next slide really is one of the slides that we've just shown to describe our approach. So scale and density and massing is important. Advancing our skyline is an important feature, but a human scaled entry, a human scaled experience, an arrival point where you feel comfortable walking to, driving to, and that sort of moment of gravity, which is then that Park at Freedom's Port and that monument to our history, all seem to make sense right where that large arrow is shown at the corner of Light and Pratt. When you start to put it all together, the larger image on screen here has got some of the basic volumes, program volumes cited on the plan that Claire walked us through, with the Park at Freedom's Port and its topography, the idea of water connecting to the corner and delivering you to the water itself, and then of course the multi-layered promenade, the upper, the fixed and the floating on the water's edge, all of that coming together really started to get us excited about what the potential of this experience could be. It is both, it's undulating in terms of what it's doing to the skyline. It is undulating in terms of what it's doing to topography, and it's really experiential in terms of how it connects you to the water, both with fixed and floating platform opportunities. So as we started to then dig into more of the massing and how the massing should respond when you start to shape architecture, again, driven by the idea of connection to both the water, to the sky, to air, to light and views, the idea of, when buildings land, how can we do things like cut corners? Can we raise corners? Can we open up roofs so that there's both access and views to the water? Can we negotiate multiple levels in buildings to get from one level to the ground plane and to the waterfront and still be in contact, in connection with the building itself? And then ultimately, how do things like floating wetlands and features that are going to be on the water surface itself, how do they relate in a very sort of easy to understand and organic way to architecture that might land on the site? And so what you're seeing now on screen is the final outcome of how we approach this. And you'll see, of course, the sail naturally by its shape, it really starts to shape public space. It really embraces the park at Freedom's Port. The sail is the one that's described as 201 East Pratt Street there. You'll see the spaces between the buildings that extend to relate to the urban grid to allow that natural progression. And you'll see a 303 Light Street, instead of building a singular building, it became two buildings, again, to allow that sort of perpendicular relationship to Light Street and also access to and from the water. The final program in terms of square footage is shown what's on screen here. So 303 Light Street is really 29 levels at the very highest, the higher of the two towers. The lower one is 24 levels. And then the sail itself is about 175 feet tall, about 250,000 square feet. And then 203 East Pratt is 8 levels and 150,000 square feet. So we feel like this distribution of program is starting to go the right way. And when you look at it on a site plan, the final site plan, again, you can see here, this is I'll just highlight 303 Light Street toward the bottom of the page. And you can see how the two volumes, the two towers there, allow for that space between connection, views, walkability, etc.
I'm just going to add a little bit more detail on the landscape and the detailing. We wanted to summarize everything you just saw in that summary site plan. What does it mean in terms of ecosystems and living materiality? Those three blue sky concepts that Vaki introduced at the very beginning, elements of all of those have made their way into the landscape architecture of the project. The major typology that we see here on the plan is the trees, the urban canopy, which we're calling the urbane canopy. For the most part, it's paved below. That's a practical decision. It allows capacity. It allows festivals and crowds. That goes hand in hand with increased soil volume and structural cells. It's a really tough place to be a street tree right now. So everywhere you see trees, we're bringing in the new infrastructure that's going to make those trees thrive and work within our critical area. We also have a series of other typologies that are a bit smaller, but nonetheless powerful. Native meadow, we're seeing this within the park at Freedom Sport, flanking those beautiful water features. And then the water features themselves, both at Conway and at the park at Freedom Sport and in the floating wetlands, this is an opportunity to start to kind of tie to that lower left reference image, bringing in aquatic planting, water quality improvements, and tying to what was the historic ecosystem condition, which is a kind of marsh typology. Last but not least, we do have some flexible lawn with turf grass. This delivers not an ecological function, but a really important programmatic one. We want people to get out and be able to run around down here on the waterfront. Very simply, just summarizing our circulation. Again, the study area of Pratt and Light, we talked about those at the very beginning. These are all about creating beautiful urban shady boulevards. So those are primary, and they take you right through the new massing to the promenade. In gold here, you see our kind of secondary gateways, which also something we don't have today, and we'll show more of this, allows us to cut through the fabric of the redevelopment area, and then tertiary circulation for wandering. this is what it feels like on the ground. Pavlina, this is another place that you can see one particular condition where we have upper promenade fixed, we have lower floating. This is right in front of the World Trade Center. You can see the key image on the upper right. And what's really nice here is how much we've seeded ground plane and open public realm in the project. So you see how much space there is, more than we have today. Universal accessibility is really important in this project. So this, yep.
Sorry, there's a little bit of a delay. If you could go back, I think it's important, just every time we see an image that kind of describes, if you go back to the previous slide that describes that condition, that we can understand it relative to today. So this is the +10 level and it's flat, right? That's what you're describing, and that there's the floating wetland down.
So this is on the Pratt Street. We're at 9.5, not to split hairs,
Yeah.
but we're a little lower.
Yeah.
And then we have the bulkhead.
It's not stepping. Yeah.
Correct. Correct. So this is less than 2% always, ramping, going down to Pratt Street at less than 2% grade. And then you can see in the kind of mid-ground of this image how that lower floating dock starts to ascend back up. This is a very kind of gracious, easy slope going back up to where we have the fixed condition at the park.
And so today, the edge of the bulkhead is right where you're showing it, but it is lower, right? So this is the raised bulkhead. And
that's right.
The space that we're seeing on the right carved out, is that the office building base?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. And where is that relationship? So those are the floating wetlands. Where is the relationship to the swimming islands and things like that? Is it behind us?
So it's just off the image to the left. In the floating sun decks, the wetlands are sort of focused on the western side. We want to create a kind of habitat zone on the west, and then the more active area where we have the swimming and the boating is on the eastern side. So I realize the key plan is really small, but we're sort of, the more recreational is just off this view, and then what we're seeing is the wetland focus on the western part of those sun decks. And I will say
so
to
office, yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I might be just saying what you were just about to ask, but the office is above cantilevering, and we've sort of carved out public space below the soffit of that office building.
And what is the program on the ground level there?
Depends on the tenant.
Okay.
It's predominantly open space for seating and general public enjoyment.
The covered area, but the base level there is something commercial tenant
To be
driven?
determined.
Okay.
To be determined. We don't know yet.
Thank you. Please carry on. Thank you for the clarifications. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So just to come back to this one, universal accessibility, we have a little definition here, and to us this really goes hand in hand with equity. We want to create a place that young folks, our elders, anyone with any mobility can navigate the site very easily. And I said earlier, because we're flat, this is actually a pretty easy lift. Everything in yellow is less than 2%, barrier-free, very easy to navigate, whether you're pushing twins in a double stroller or grandma in a wheelchair, easy to get around. The orange arrows are places that we go up to 5%, or we have gangways that get us down to those lower level floating docks. And then also in blue, those are some key connections that are connecting us to the floating sun decks. So the idea here is everybody can traverse this area together. And then that goes hand in hand with the different programs. There's a lot on this slide, but just to reiterate how important seating is, you see that in the lower left. We have fixed custom back seating, which is a nice place to linger. That's predominantly in the shade. And then we have seating also used as the kind of edge condition at the promenade. And then lots of flexibility. We don't believe that any program should be fixed 365. This plan is really meant to accommodate memorial and serenity in the everyday, and can seamlessly toggle into events and ice skating, and we have lots of options within the plan. So the idea is that it can adapt and be flexible in perpetuity.
Great. So we want to dig a little deeper into when we say connecting to our waterfront. Exactly what does that look like? What does that feel like? We talked about the urban grid, etc. But I love this diagram because it shows not only where those opportunities are with regard to streets, how the streets extend to the water effectively, but even the role that the buildings play in allowing opportunities for people to connect through buildings. So whereas today you can't do any of it except in McKeldin Plaza, tomorrow we think that there are going to be multiple ways to get through, between, and down the streets to the waterfront. This is a really, really important part of the narrative and the approach in our design. So let's look at some of these spaces that actually are going to occupy between the buildings. This section that's on screen is a section looking north, cut just south of Pratt Street, between the building known as the Sale and the office building that we were just talking about, Pavlina. So you'll notice that we've created a 65-foot clear space between the buildings, and we're going to talk about the character of these spaces in just a moment following this page. But this is an important piece here just to understand the proportion of the space between the buildings and that we will be creating as a result of what we're doing. So if you advance to the next slide, here's a rendering of that same view, and you can see clearly how South Street is coming through between the two buildings there, and then how the Sale really starts to kind of swoop down towards the Park at Freedom's port, just to get a sense of that proportion. If you advance to the next slide, here's a section that's taken in the north-south looking east. It's really going to be looking at, from the left on the diagram that's at the bottom here, from the left is the Park at Freedom's port. Then we have the small pavilion that we have that supports it, and then building up to the mixed-use building, which is the tall building in the multiple colors there. So digging a little deeper into this, I think this space is really, really, really important to understand. This is a view that's taken between the two buildings of the mixed-use residential parcel. It is the arrival space for the lobby experience, the drop-off area. So cars will be able to navigate this space. So you'll be able to drive up right here where this gentleman in the suit is shown. You'll be able to drop off, and we imagine this space being activated with retail and of course the building lobbies. But I think the most important thing is here, when you're standing at Light Street and you'll be able to see the power plant building, the National Aquarium, and this curated environment space and the water as you've never done before. You've not been able to do this. You cannot do this today. This is something that we're really, really excited about. We believe that, you'll see also our approach with regard to service and loading, etc., that we can create beautiful, really, really well curated, landscaped environments that enhance the experience as opposed to going the other way. So if you go to the next slide, so here's a section through that residential building looking the other way, looking at Light Street this time, and you can get a sense of the relative heights of not only the towers themselves, but the spaces between them, the 80 feet that's shown between the two residential buildings, and the 65 feet that's shown between the residential piece and the pavilion that's on the right side. Now that is an extension of Camden Street. Camden Street presently on the western side of Light Street is kind of a loading focused street. But we think that has, of course, a very important urbanistic role in terms of not only servicing these buildings, but also can be an enhancer of the experience, which we certainly plan to do. And you'll see a view of that coming up. So just to close the loop on what the experience of the ground plane is at this residential development, this mixed-use residential development. This is on the water side. So this is on the eastern side of the two buildings. The space we were just looking at, the last rendering, is of that space between the towers right there. So it's very, very welcoming. We think the scale is going to be very exciting. Of course, we talked about all the design features associated with the promenade and the greening, as well as all of the negotiation of the ground plane from getting up from that 10 level down toward the waterfront. All of that will come together to really provide a kind of intense but multi-experiential experience there. So if you were to take all of the buildings off of the ground and leave just the ground plane, just the ground floor of all of the buildings, this is what you would see. What's shown in call it the reddish color, the darker of the reddish colors, is a retail. We believe that the ground plane should really be well activated with retail. So you'll see a bunch of that. The pink, sort of lighter red, that's shown in the sale building. That space right there is really, it's going to have a cultural function to it. It is both a connection to get from Pratt Street down to the Constellation and to the water, but it'll be open, it'll be inviting, it'll connect you to the retail. That's what that is. The office building you were just speaking about, Pavlina, is what's shown on the top right in the bluish color. The gray pieces in all of the buildings are where loading will occur, and I'll talk about that more specifically on this diagram right here. You can see how our approach to loading is to pull all of the loading vehicles off of Light Street and Pratt Street as much as possible. So, and then the loading docks of the buildings themselves are concealed. They are obscured, and then the spaces that are functionally available to loading are enhanced with architectural elements that are shown in the three views that are on the left-hand side. They are the three renderings that were on just, if you just step back to the image before, rendering A, which is taken off of Pratt Street, you can see the character of the street. That is a loading street. All three of those views will be functioning as loading spaces, but all three of them will enhance the urban experience, activate the street, and provide access to and from the water. Next slide, please. So looking at the space between the Park at Freedom's Port and the residential building, which is, if you look at the top left image where it says number 1, that's the space we're talking about. This is the extension of Camden Street from the west side of Light Street toward the water. This is how we will provide for not only loading, but service, as that diagram showed. I think, Adam, if it's you driving, if you could just step back, I think it's important that we understand that the fire lane approach there for service vehicles, for loading, all of that would be captured within the Camden Street extension, but you can see with the red colors on either side of it, we expect that environment to be well activated. The section below really shows that the relative heights between buildings right there, and you'll see in the view that follows that we expect that image on the right to be very, very attractive. Today you can't see the power plant building from Light Street. Tomorrow you will. What's shown on the left is what you see today, which is the backside of the Light Street Pavilion, and what's shown on the right is what we imagine for the future. Let's move on to the space between the two residential towers. You can see, again, I mentioned the drop-off that would happen between those two towers. So we want the lobbies to face each other and the loading to be on the backside of those buildings. So we really think that this is going to be a very, very well-activated space with lots of great landscape architecture supporting it, and of course, people moving overhead and on the ground plane as well. Again, comparative view for what you see today, which is really the backside again of the Light Street Pavilion, and what we expect to see tomorrow, which is a new view of the power plant and the water and the National Aquarium. Number 3 is the space that we're calling the Conway Street extension. This aligns with Conway Street. And again, this is both an access to, it's a front door of the visitor center. We think that this idea of creating the Conway Gardens that really activate that front door experience is really great. And we can also use that to obscure and conceal the loading that's required for the residential building, the South Tower, as shown there on the diagram at the top right. The next slide will show again the comparative view of what you see today on the left. You can see the visitor center on the right-hand side of that left-hand image. It's also consistently shown on the other image on the right. But now you can see how the residential tower starts to really shape your sort of view corridor. And especially when you're really turned onto Conway Street off of 395 going east, we feel like this view will be something special of the National Aquarium and the visitor center and this new activated ground plane at the bottom of the residential.
So hold on, Vaki, for a second. So in there, that drive, that lane that's next to the building, that's the access for loading, right?
Yes, correct. So
The vehicles will be cutting through the multi-use lane and sort of waiting for people to scatter and then go into the loading area? I mean, how
yeah,
does
so
this work?
yeah,
I'm sorry.
yeah,
It's a great picture.
it's a great question. I think it's one of the it's a detail that's maybe not resolved on this
Okay, got it.
image per se, Pavlina, but you are
Probably
correct.
before the loading was figured out. Okay.
Yeah,
A very quick
yeah,
second question. I
Pavlina.
realize I'm loading the questions up front. We're getting close to the end of the presentation. There'll be plenty other questions, but just for clarity, when you say loading, is that purely services or does that include parking as well?
It's
For the
purely
building.
services.
Got it. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, space number 4 is the space that is immediately west of the Sale building. Um, it's really the edge of the Park at Freedom's port and where it meets the Sale. So this is, I think, a lot easier to understand because there's no building there today, and all that Sale kind of gradually lifts up of that space. So if you go to the next slide, Adam, I think this view that we showed here, you've seen the one on the right before, but we think it's an important piece to describe here because everything that Claire and Professor Green were talking about is really captured in the view on the right relative to what we have on the left. So lush green, the significant water feature, the real purpose to the space, obviously the absence of the traffic driving through, but the architecture on the left and the right of that image really serving a purpose of shaping that experience and capturing the extents of the park in a very appropriate way and highlighting, we think, the national monument of the Constellation. Next slide. Finally, space number 5, this is between that office building that you were referring to, Pavlina, and the Sale itself. So you can see again on that top right image, look at how the loading works off of the extension of the street. And the fire lane is also utilized in that same moment. The space between the street, that 65-foot width between the buildings, is a little wider at the ground plane based on some recessed space in the office building. But if you go to the next slide, again, this one here is really powerful because when you're downtown, you simply cannot see Federal Hill Park. That's a national monument that we just don't get any sense of from downtown. And then in the future, we think we will. And these buildings play a prominent role in shaping that view shed, as well as, of course, serving the functional needs of loading and service as well. And then finally, just wrapping up again with one more look at that master plan, the site plan. And we really think that the way these buildings have kind of landed on the site, supporting the urban infrastructure, the urban planning approach, supporting the drivers from what we've heard from the community engagement of access and shading and activation and access to the water, and then also having that historical cultural tie back to the Park at Freedom's Port and the significance of Baltimore as a major center of freed slaves. We think pulling it all together, we're onto something that could be really, really special for our city. So with that, I'll pass it back to David.
All right, thank you, Vaki and Claire and Dr. Green. Thank you all. And thank you for your time today. I know this was a lot of information to absorb. I'm sure you've got a lot of questions. But we do believe that we've presented a vision which prioritizes our amazing assets and our waterfront, local businesses, and what we hope will be a major catalyst for the economic growth of our city. So with that, we'll hand it over to you for questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your time, for your work in pulling this together. And it is indeed a lot of information. And we appreciate the clarity with which you're communicating. I managed to sneak in a few questions there along the way, just to make sure that we can follow and fill in all the gaps. I'm sure there's plenty more questions to ask from the panel. I'll turn it over to them in a second. I just want to preface sort of the second part of our time together today is that it is a lot of information and there is a lot of it's okay if at some point, we haven't gotten this and we haven't figured it out yet, sort of how the earlier renderings that are now overlaying with some of the pragmatic decisions and solutions about the building. There's going to be quite a bit of that, and it's okay if it's not there yet. It's simply we're adding it to the list of things that we're going to be looking for in the future presentations, and then to continue to resolve. But one thing I would say is that part of the reason why some of the things will be happening in our conversation today is because typically when we review master plans, the amount of development when it comes to the vertical and the horizontal development is a lot less sort of realized, so to speak. Not so much resolved, but realized. So I feel like, and that's been a little bit of the issue when the project came the first time, is that there's quite a bit of realization, and part of it is sort of visioning. Part of the visioning exercise is to realize how these things would look and what they would feel like and how all of that, and then sort of as a second layer to that comes, well, how does this work and the loading? And so once we open up these views, they also become our service streets, and how can we do this well together, right? So there's quite a bit of just purely master planning and systems thinking thing that is coming now into the project. There's a little bit of post rationalization. There's a little bit of like, let's make this work, and it's okay. I want to say that not every project is alike, and not every project develops differently. This happened to be one that sort of worked on its own for a while and is only now sort of coming to a master plan discussion after there's like buildings and things like that in place. We will take it exactly where it is and work with it. But I say this to ask you, the project team, the developer, the designers, and everybody, to keep an open mind. I know that perhaps some of these ideas are very precious. I know you love your buildings. I know you've been looking at them for a while. They're not bad. Nobody in this panel will ever say that they're bad. But we want you to keep an open mind and understand that design isn't a linear process, and there's a couple steps back with 5 steps forward on certain elements that may occur. And, you know, bear with us as we play sort of your external eye on the project. We welcome all of your hard work, and we appreciate it. And we know how much it goes into pulling all of this together. So enough of that preface and disclaimer. I want the panel to be able to talk with kind of without limitations, like, well, this is already figured out and therefore we're not touching it. Let's sort of keep an open mind on each realm, on the project team realm and on the reviewers realm, so that we can have a more robust discussion on the design of this proposal. Without much more forwarding, I'd like to do a round of questions and answers with the panel. Sometimes comments come along the way. I'm not too worried about it, but I think the goal is to cycle back through some of the drawings and ask any clarifying questions. You know, there's a lot of information. It's very dense. Some things are resolved, some are not, some are talking to each other, other are not. It'll be nice to sort it out to a degree where everyone has the same understanding, and then we can kind of engage in comments at the last portion of our meeting today. With that said, I'd like to start with Osborne Anthony, and see if he has any questions for the project and the project team. Osborne,
Sure.
do you mind?
Thank you,
Thank you.
Pavlina, and thank you, team, for taking on such a really challenging project. You know, it is Baltimore. It is one of Baltimore's cherished areas, the waterfront. And to be able to see something moving forward, I think is refreshing. And thanks for that. I do have a few questions, though. The first kind of relates to the program in some sense. Um, and as always, you know, I'm confronted with what's there today and the experiences of the past several years, several decades, in terms of how the city utilizes the waterfront area. And it just seems to me that there are two key pieces of program that are either removed or maybe integrated, but it's just not explained or thought about just yet. So as you know, you think of that whole area that we used to refer to as the amphitheater, you know, that park, that key piece. And, you know, we understand you put in something very special there. We get that. But as a general community use, as you know, even in the wintertime, there's a skating rink that's there. Are there any considerations for that portion of the program? Maintaining that, relocating it? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, so on this slide, Osborne, thank you for that question. It's something we heard over and over again from people across the city is we love the ice skating rink. All you need to do is go down during the holidays and see people down there. So on this image, you can see in dotted black lines down by Conway Street. In this area, we have multiple locations for a skating rink. Those are for full-size options. We also do protect the ability to have an installation up here, what we consider the crescent. But I think the idea of being multifunctional and adaptable is an important piece to this plan, that we are including those items, but there are multiple options for its installation.
Great,
Osborne,
thanks.
I had kids who would kill me if I got rid of that skating. If we got rid of that skating rink. So yeah, we'll figure out how
Me
to get
too.
it back. It's important.
Wonderful. And then related to that as well, so you kind of mapped out an area that's kind of defined maybe the boundaries of your project scope, and it seems as though a lot of that extended to the southern area and all the way over to Rusty Scupper, but mostly, I guess, to restore and kind of stabilize the waterfront based on resiliency and activities such like that. But related to that as well, and now that you're kind of shifting the bulkhead and raising it to some degree, and you creating that kind of a floating walkway pretty much all around, certainly the west shore and maybe the northern area as well. Um, my question is, what about activities such as community type boating? Right now, if I have my own, I can pull up a boat to to a pier, wherever. Plus, there's kind of commercial activities there related to boat rides and so forth. What happens to that activity?
So I can speak a little bit to that. We have not taken any of those opportunities away. Let me start with the southern end of the study area. So along Rash Field, really the only change to the waterfront there is a kind of aspirational one to incorporate new pavement and trees for resiliency. We're not changing the bulkhead down there. It's actually a riprap condition. However, when we wrap the rest of the site, so we're leaving that kind of trident-shaped marina that you see and then slipping in these other floating docks. So flanking that trident marina, additional floating docks, that gives the opportunity for community boating for anybody to tie up there or along Rash Field, and then it goes to the fixed condition. We did test this idea with the maritime engineers, Moffett Nickel, on the team, because we don't want to displace any programs that are there now. So when the Argentine Navy comes to town, they can still come and tie up along the fixed dock. So that's a really important piece of having both the floating and the fixed. And then we think the sun deck area, that gives a kind of whole other layer of recreational boating that we don't see a lot of today. So I'm talking about stand-up paddleboard, kayak, kind of rentals of the kind of smaller human-powered craft. That would sort of be more organized around World Trade Center. So it gives more opportunity for different kinds of programs than we have today without displacing any of the programs that people really love. And I include in that the large ships, the party boats, the rentals, all of those things. It all fits.
Okay, and that's going to be properly integrated with the lower floating walkway, right?
That's right.
In other words, it's, yeah, okay. All right, that's a detail that can be probably resolved at some future date, and that's fine. And along those lines as well, the bulkhead, raising that bulkhead, you're raising that elevation. So arguably now you're creating more of an element that's could be a visual impediment if you're on the water or if you're at the lower walkway. And I'm wondering, what exactly are your thoughts related to that, and how would you kind of mitigate that condition? Bulkheads are not necessarily attractive things, and I'm a little bit concerned about that because now we do have the ability to walk down to the water and touch the water. And unless you're on that floating walkway, which is kind of a moving element, not everyone can navigate that area very well. What are you thinking in terms of a visual mitigation for that area?
Yes, thank you for that question. So this is, you're absolutely right. We see here in this image, where you see this sort of paneled wooden area, that's a cladding. The idea, early idea, is a kind of cladding on a rebuilt and raised seawall. So instead of being at about 6.5 right now, we would take it vertically up to 10. We want to beautify it and create something really, really lovely, because you're absolutely right. People are going to have a kind of eye level view of that, because now they're sitting about 6 to 10 feet down, depending on what the tide is. And we don't want people looking into kind of a nasty barnacle-covered sheet pile. This is taken from a project, or inspired by a project in DC down at the wharf, where they did a kind of similar timber cladding. We think it's lovely, it's humane, you know, it's early, kind of an early detailing conversation. It also ties to the historic construction of how the waterfronts were built, that when we were building out over the water, it was typically in wood. We lost all that in the Great Fire. So this is the opportunity to bring that kind of soft tactility back to the waterfront. The other thing, just since we're on this slide, I just wanted to kind of note the tow rails and the benches and the opportunity for mooring along these floating docks. That's part of the kind of integration of community boating on the right-hand side of this image. And then lastly, I'm really glad you mentioned mobility, because I think you're right. We could have done all floating docks, or we could have done all fixed docks. But different strokes for different folks. Some people are not going to want to be floating. They're going to want to be on a kind of fixed platform. For other, you know, for kids, I mean, that's where they want to be, you know. So that's why we have both. It's both a kind of mobility inclusion idea, but also the ability to get up and down to different levels. So I covered maybe more than you asked there, but thank you for the prompt.
No, and thanks for that information. It's very, very useful. And then finally, my last group of questions, or single question, relates to the Light Street experience. And as you know, you arrive into the city. Most, if you do by car, you arrive on Conway. You come down that route, you headed east, and you know, you're presented with the visitors center with the backdrop of the aquarium, and you know. So as you kind of navigate and modify the street grid there, uh, I'm a little curious. I'm still not quite following the interaction with the new buildings as you walk up and down Light Street, and access to those loading areas, as you just kind of started to explain. If we can go back to the site plan just very quickly, I have one very specific question related to that. I think it was suggested that the idea of the drop-off pickup area for the two buildings that are being proposed is between the buildings, or is it right there? So the idea is, as you turn a left out of Conway, you have to make a quick sharp right into that drop-off area, and it's some kind of a loop around that gets you back out there as well.
That's correct.
So is it not a little bit challenging, considering I'm assuming a Light Street, that segment of Light Street from Pratt South towards Fed Hill, is now going to be two ways?
That's correct.
Yeah, that's correct, Osborne. It's two ways today. And so that would be your ability to continue moving in and out of that particular site.
So if I'm a visitor who's visiting someone there, or I'm an Uber driver, for instance, rideshare, I pull in, loop around, drop my person off. The only direction I can head is north up Light Street towards the intersection at Pratt.
You know, I don't think we had that detail fully worked out, but it is a good point that you can see kind of this notion of a break in the median where you could come across, but that's something we really need to move through when we're evaluating traffic with the Department of Transportation.
Yeah, I'm just curious, because it seems to me there's an opportunity to utilize the intersection of Light and Conway in a more meaningful direction to organize how you get into your site, not just for day-to-day drop-offs and pickups, but in terms of even the loading associated with those two facilities. It is a key and major point, and I think I think what's being proposed here is a little bit of a comment, yes, but I'll get to it later. I think what's being proposed here is a little bit challenging, and I don't want you to underestimate the challenges associated with this block.
Yes.
Let's put it that way, right? The other piece to this is I believe there's a bike lane that continues through here. So I think Pavlina kind of hinted to that. You're crossing all of that. So it's another layer of complexity. And I'm wondering, has there been any conversation with the city and others in terms of how that bike lane will be affected or properly even better integrated across this area here?
Yeah, it's a great question, Osborne. So we have walked through this with the Department of Transportation a couple times. It's interesting to note that that condition actually exists today. So loading for the buildings crosses the bike path, as does entrance on the Pratt Street side as well. So while it's a common condition, we recognize that safety for that area is extremely important. So we're going to need to work through that with DOT as we implement this plan.
Let's add one more thing, that in the kind of general conditions right now, the loading is crossing that shared use path at 45-degree angles and a lot of diagonals. That's actually pretty dangerous. Almost every single condition that we have here, we are suggesting a T junction, the safest possible traffic intersection that we can do. So it gives us more visibility. You know, it's a more standard kind of AASHTO and shared streets approach. So that's a kind of general approach to how shared use and traffic will interface in the plan.
All right, thank you all. I'll pause here, Pavlina, and turn it over to the rest of the group.
Thank you, Osborne. Sharon, what are your questions for the team?
Pavlina, a few in three categories. The grading and accessibility, that was a big question for me last time, and the clarity of this presentation did answer a lot of my questions, so thank you. I appreciated the grading plan, the universal access studies. That was very useful to understand how you're getting from level to level with the upper promenade and the lower promenade and the floating promenades, and how all those different levels are working together and how they're accessible. So yes, I appreciated that. And actually the slide answers one, gets to one of my questions. The promenade up near the World Trade Center, the blue arrow, is that an ADA compliant route down to that?
It is, and we have two different kinds of blue from a code perspective. So that one going from Constellation Pier to the lower promenade, that's going to be less than 5, and then take us down to the floating dock. Where we see those little arrow connections to the sun docks, that's where maritime code is triggered. They have a slightly different way of looking at everything. For the most part, we want to be handrail free, less than 5 everywhere. When we're crossing water, however, we will trigger handrails. So those little blue arrow connections, that's where we'll have a little handrail connecting each of those sun deck elements.
Okay, thanks. And then, so you are raising the upper promenade to 9.5 or 10, and I saw in the grading plan that's naturally pitching everything back toward Light and Pratt. So I assume that then that triggers a new stormwater management system at those streets, because you're then sending stormwater in that direction, probably in a way that is not happening today.
That's correct.
Okay. All right.
I'll just.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Sharon. I was just going to add, it does pitch towards Pratt and Light today. Those civilians are essentially on berms. So it's not reversing a condition that we have today, but it will need to be looked at in addition to the new flood levels in FEMA and all the rest. So it's a sort of yes and yes question.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Next question was a couple questions about programming, and your goals for the project were very, very clear. And again, that really helps us understand the basis for a lot of the design decisions and the direction that you're going in. And the idea of big water, I understood that very clearly, and I wanted to get your thoughts on how the increase in programming on the water is reconciled with that. You do run the risk of over-programming the water. We don't think of water space as programming space like the park, but you are actually treating the water as a park. And how are you reconciling all of that new programming, for example, at the World Trade Center with the big water idea?
That's a great question. I think the way we thought about programming in the public realm was, rather than kind of taking anything away, we want to offer options. So it's early days. It might not look exactly like this in the Sundex, but we wanted to deliver things that are not there today and right-size them. Today, there's almost no recreation on the water, truly public, where you can get a kayak or jump in the water. There's precious little habitat value on the water. So this is a kind of program now that is giving diverse choices, something for everybody, something that everybody can connect to. Is it exactly the right proportion? I'm sure the Army Corps will have something to say about that when we get there. But we want to introduce all these elements that we felt are really, really important and missing today. And that goes back to the historic research. We've lost our native ecosystems. We've lost our recreation, public recreation on the water. We've lost the ability to do a number of things. So we're trying to incorporate pieces of all of that back in the plan. But I think it's a great comment. Is the proportion exactly dialed in? I mean, we're at master plan, so I think that's certainly to be discussed and to be dialed in as we go.
Claire, if you don't mind me jumping in on that one too, Sharon, I really like your question. And, you know, when we thought about big water as a concept, it's about, that's a representation of how we get the water closer connected to the people. That's a simple way to put it. Like, how can you really make it feel like it's our water? And one strategy is just bring it closer, like make it, just put it right there, right? The other strategy, I think, when you expand the thinking to today versus back then, big water could be about usability of the water, could be about activation of the water, as opposed to necessarily, proximity and the commercial function of the water. Today, you don't have that. We don't enjoy our water in any kind of way. It's been a long time since we have, and I don't know what cities up and down the East Coast have the ability to enjoy the water the way we're proposing it. So I think that for us in our city, being able to be at the forefront of saying we want to own our water, we want to use our water, we want to activate our water, in my mind, that's an interpretation of the big water idea that gets around the idea of the constraint that we have of the bulkhead that prohibits the geographical extension of the water's edge to the intersection of the streets, if that makes sense.
All right, thank you. My other question related to that is about water quality, and obviously you'll be working to see that health and safety of the public and actually participating in the water to that degree, sharing that same water space with commercial vehicles and gas-powered vehicles and so forth. So I assume there's something in place to monitor water quality as well.
So the answer is yes. The Healthy Harbor Initiative, through our partners at the Waterfront Partnership, have done amazing work in transforming the health of the Chesapeake Bay and its watershed, including the Inner Harbor. So much so that they jumped in last year and will be jumping in again this year. So that's something that the city's deeply focused on, that the stakeholders around the area are deeply focused on. And then ultimately, the city of Baltimore was focused on during community engagement. It was the most liked image at our September 30th community engagement meeting were the floating islands in Copenhagen, and our friends from 3XN can tell you that Copenhagen's harbor was every bit as nasty as ours was, but now people swim in it today.
Okay, great to hear. And then other programming question had to do with the area. One of your initial diagrams showed the project scope, which again, we appreciated because it was unclear before what the project extents were. But we didn't hear a lot about the area south of Conway, the Conway Street Park, the shaded area to the south of Conway Street. Is that still in progress?
Yes, I can speak to that, Sharon. So the light street, of course, is study area only. So that kind of continues with the complete streets and the Green Boulevard sections that Vaki shared. As far as West Shore Park goes, the way we've thought about it, and we can maybe go to the aerial here in a second, the core of that park is really great. It works really well, but the edges are pretty unfriendly. So in both re-envisioning Light Street in concept, but then in really taking on the promenade within our project area, and I realize this is kind of zoomed out, we've been able to basically, through lifting the promenade to 10 feet in this area, create accessibility into West Shore Park and make it a lot more usable. So right now, you know, the promenade sits a little bit lower and it's kind of an unfriendly barrier to get up into West Shore. So we kind of get a win-win here by raising the promenade. Everything is at the same level. We grade back to Light Street around the edges of the park, and then it really becomes then a programming and activation question. The park is very well used, but not so easy to access. So for us, it became about promenade side access to the park. And then the last thing I'll say is wrapping around Rash Field. That's a pretty light touch. Not a lot of work on the maritime side there, but thinking about pavements and potentially trees. I didn't speak to the pavements here, but we're thinking of replacing them for a higher albedo or higher reflectivity pavement type so that we're not getting that baking hot, you know, irradiated red oven feeling that we get in the summer. So we have lighter pavements, more reflective, and we'd like to apply that within the entire project area so that we create a nicer microclimate for people.
Okay,
I hope
thank you.
that addresses it.
Yes, it definitely added some clarification. And then finally, I had similar questions that Pavlina and Osborne raised about vehicular and pedestrian circulation and how they're overlapped. And you've described that, so it's not as much of a question as a request for an overlaid circulation plan that shows both and how they're working together. And to Osborne's earlier point, and how are service vehicles and drop-off vehicles interacting with pedestrians in these key places. And as Pavlina pointed out, it wasn't really clear on the perspective rendering so far. So I assume we'll see clarifications about how those modes of circulation are interacting. And you certainly have plenty of precedents in the area. The Wharf does a good job with it in DC. So I'm assuming that will be further clarified in future iterations. And those were all my questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Sharon. Kevin, what are your questions for the team? Hey, Kevin, I don't know if you're muted. I don't see.
Yeah, oh, sorry.
There he is.
Okay, good, thank you. First question is about parking. How are you dealing with parking site-wide, just generally?
I mean, yeah, you take it.
Yeah, so the answer is we're allowing for parking under this plan, but it's not fully established yet. The notion is that to the extent parking exists within this project footprint, so the project area itself, it would be obstructed from view in its entirety, meaning either underground or above grade and wrapped with residential units. The other way we deal with this is there are approximately 6,500 parking spaces within a 3/4 mile radius of this site, and that is about 40% utilized according to the city's studies.
Okay. I mean, I appreciate that. I'm sorry. If someone else wanted to weigh in, go ahead.
No, sir.
No, you're good. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, I think, you know, putting parking below or above each of those has a pretty incredibly challenging sort of, you know, logistics. Just going back to the earlier questions about where it interfaces with parking and people. I'm sorry, with loading and places for people and all of that. So I just think it's kind of in some ways if you're planning to put parking beneath this plan, it's sort of time is now to explore how that's happening. Because yeah, as you know, we keep talking about the Wharf in DC, but that's a significant piece of that planning, and it affects, you know, ground plane. It affects like pressurization, you know, from water, but you know, up against the bulkhead and where you can put trees in your big shade concept. That is so if that's the intent, I mean, I kind of like love that I didn't see any mention of it, but I kind of know in the back of my head that you're ultimately going to be selling apartments and condos, and you're going to have to address, you know, environments. So this just seems like a big a big missing piece of this right now. And then a couple other questions. Then was a hotel use ever considered? Just out of curiosity, on the site.
It's not currently contemplated, but could be in the future.
Yeah. And then I guess I'll just leave this last question about the Trade Center building. It's kind of right in the middle of that northern piece with all that amazing stuff happening. What were the implications of raising the bulkhead with that? And was there thought about the ground plane of the Trade Center building?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Kevin. We met with representatives from the Port Administration, the owner of the building, last week, as a matter of fact. The notion is actually their basement flooded during Isabel.
Yes.
So this is a net benefit to them. And so coordinating that exact kind of promenade installation is something we're going to be doing with their engineers, but they, I think, would say that this is a net positive to enhance their resiliency in that area as well.
Okay, thanks. Oh, wait, last question. Is there an affordable component to the housing mix, unit mix on parcel E?
Sorry, Kevin, we couldn't understand you. One more time.
Is there an affordable housing component to the residential mix on parcel E?
Yes.
And what is that?
It's 10% at 60%, right?
Yeah, so the city just recently passed its inclusionary housing legislation, which requires a minimum of 10% at 60% of area median income. And we will, of course, meet the city's requirements for new residential development.
Thanks. Back to you, Pavlina.
Thank you, Kevin. I asked a lot of the kind of more logistical questions along the way. I think I have a pretty good grasp of things as they relate to the drawings. My only question is about just going back to the slide you introduced about the area of study versus the really boundaries of the project. And as we know, MCB has control of the existing pavilions and not the rest of the site, but as part of the master planning exercise, you're asked to study the larger site. And we understand that that would involve completely different processes, just a traffic realignment alone, and then perhaps as a separate entity, also the waterfront improvements along the bulkhead. So I'm trying to understand a little bit, because it's all presented as one vision and it's all eventually perhaps going to end up into one master plan. How dependent are the different pieces on each other? And I'm going to separate them in those three groups: the buildings versus the street redos versus the waterfront bulkhead improvements. So for example, can you go to the slide that's before this one where we see the existing buildings and the proposed? So in theory, you could build, MCB can come and build the 2 towers and the sale and the office building, and kind of with the streets remaining completely intact as they are today, same as the bulkhead and the waterfront. So knowing that these are three things and you don't control fully the other two, what are your thoughts on some of the sequencing, on the dependability of the pieces on each other? I want to hear your thoughts a little bit about the reality of this master plan and the development. And have you had any conversations on, both phasing, but also contingencies, right? What if, the street realignment doesn't end up exactly the way you're drawing it once you actually go through the process of approval? What are your thoughts on that? What are the conversations that you've had so far with relation to these different pieces of the puzzle?
Yeah, it's a great question, Pavlina. And I think where we would start is, as everybody saw at the beginning of last month, less than a month ago, the Inner Harbor flooded out. And so no matter what happens, whether we build our buildings or not, the promenade needs to be dealt with. The electrical systems are underwater. The structure is failing. And the RK&K State of Good Repair report tells us that. So, I would say the public space improvements are needed regardless of whether the buildings are modified, given that those systems themselves are in fact dangerous. And so then you look at the right of way, we believe that the narrowing of Light and Pratt creates a better pedestrian realm, which will make a more livable and better downtown Baltimore. So we think they're extremely important. I think they're all interdependent on each other, and creating the activity, the safety, the accessibility to the water, the resiliency, all of that is tied into the completion of all of these improvements. Now, we are at the master plan stage, so there are going to be changes made over time, but I think it's very important to note that the promenade needs to be raised, the systems there need to be modified, the rights of way need to be modified, at least from what we've heard from Baltimoreans, is, hey, we don't want to get hit by oncoming vehicles. And the last thing I would kind of reference is, we've talked about the wharf a little bit today. The investments in public space, solely public space, so the bulkheads, the walkways, the piers at the wharf, and this was a number of years ago when it was constructed, cost over $300 million. And so thinking about the enhancements we need to make to our waterfront, we need to recognize that as a waterfront city, if we want to continue to interact with this space, we need to make an investment in our infrastructure for us to have the next century of use. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Thank you for this. It's great to hear it is necessary. I mean, even from what Claire was mentioning, the bulkhead is deteriorating. It's not getting better, it's getting worse. And that's why there've been all of these different plans about, whether you maintain a hard bulkhead, whether you start to erode it. We've seen a variety of studies over the years with various portions of the promenade that are asking the same questions, and nothing's really happened yet. So we'll talk a little bit about it in the comments phase about this particular approach versus anything else that's been proposed before. But do you have any particular phasing in mind yet for the master plan?
We are not ready to talk about phasing yet. Still a little bit too early.
Right, understood. Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right, thank you for your clarifications. We can get into our comments and discussion. I'll come full circle around and start with Osborne Anthony. Osborne, please take it away. Share your thoughts.
Sure. Thanks again, Pavlina. And so, again, I'm very encouraged by what I'm seeing. And I think Pavlina kind of prefaced it early on, acknowledging that, yes, we're at a master plan in phase, but to be able to get to a master plan that's comprehensive and even flexible, you have to do some aspect of visioning. And I think the team has done an extraordinary job in terms of doing that. You've reached out to the community on many fronts. You've taken their input. You're certainly in the process of filtering that input and incorporating the elements that most appropriate to the project, but hopefully elements that don't necessarily uh, uh, well, certainly incorporate as much of the city in an authentic way as possible. So I agree with that, and I'm very welcoming of that approach. I think, however, the fact that the buildings are so defined, it can be a little bit misleading. So I'll try to I'll try to stay away from that and focus on what I consider to be more key ingredients that will really activate this entire waterfront area and kind of resolve some of the challenges that I think that exist today. And one key piece that I think matters is, and you're touching on this very clearly, it's access to that waterfront edge. And, certainly at South Street, you're opening up that area clearly, removing that existing pavilion and really opening up a vista to the water. And that's all good. On the contrary, at Calvert, we're kind of supposedly removing that intersection, but still there's a vista that opens up to that corner or that inflection point in the site. And I think that's all great. But then the challenge is, then what? right? So you get to the end of the roadway hits the water, you literally extend or expand the street to the water's edge, and then what? You kind of now confronted with this bulkhead, with this walkway, with this kind of experience of, navigating around the waterfront. But there's no kind of a pause. There's no decision making. There's no kind of a gathering space, as far as I'm concerned, where those streets terminate at Pratt on the south side of Pratt or on the water's edge of Pratt. There's no kind of recognition that here you are, you're now at the water. The only thing I get from this is you've opened it up mainly to create a view shed, right? And by default, there's access through that area. But I think a part of that now depends on how you program the space, what types of uses are there, whether it's commercial, whether it's something that's a little bit more civic. What are these experiences? If you can go back to the site plan, and I get it, I see, trust me, I understand what you're doing, right? Um, but where I'm going with this is I think you have to pay a little bit more attention, and maybe this is in the next iteration of the master plan as you as you get to be a little bit more granular with the spaces between the buildings and the spaces that touch the street. For instance, when that huge intersection at Light and Pratt, that's a major intersection. It's a major traffic intersection, but it's also a major pedestrian hub. And, from this image, it shows the planned park that's going in there. You're coming right up against the curb line, right up against the backside of the sidewalk. I would argue that you need to provide a little bit of relief there, mainly because it's a main entry point to the waterfront. It's a main entry point to that the heritage element that's being incorporated or programmed there. So you need to allow a little bit of relief so that folks can make decisions, folks can navigate the corners, folks can determine whether or not they want to enter or leave, etc. And then the other piece to that as well is, Pratt is a major pedestrian corridor, particularly connecting down to the Civic Center and, you know, areas to the west. So my question or my challenge to you then is how do you begin to integrate or incorporate the city into your project in terms of access, as opposed to just saying, well, we're trying to enhance the view sheds, connect the city. You have to physically show gestures as to how you begin to do that. And I think one of the key elements here is you need to identify where those key nodes are. Not every street is equal. The access to the waterfront from Commerce or South is very different to the access from Light Street, to the access from Calvert. So I think these are some of the things in the next iteration I would like to see you begin to articulate in a more meaningful and intentional way. And obviously, safety, as you pointed out, factors into that, but there are also other things that happen. Baltimore just hosted a major football game this past weekend. And you think about the large volumes of folks who move from the ball fields back to the waterfront. And how is that sort of pedestrian traffic truly accommodated as opposed to just folks just walking along the sidewalk? It needs to be a little bit more intentional. And I think the edges of your project need to be better defined in terms of how to accommodate all of that. Along those lines as well, it's the connectivity, that visual connectivity, the emphasis on the view sheds. And I will reiterate, Conway, in as much as it's the arrival point by car, by vehicle, it's a vehicular arrival point. It's also a major connection again back to the ball fields, right? So there just seems to be a little bit more that needs to happen within the boundaries of your project to acknowledge and receive all of that, whilst acknowledging the importance of these key view sheds. So I think there's got to be a little bit more analysis, and I'm sure you probably did that analysis. It's just not presented to us. And I would have liked to see that. For instance, today, the Inner Harbor is utilized by a number of folks. Within recent years, maybe less, but certainly within the last 2 decades, it's been well utilized. And who are those users? You know, who are the users of the Inner Harbor? You know, those of the past, those of the present, and who are the intended users based on the development that you're putting forward here? Um, some of us live in this area and we utilize that space every day. But our experience there would be very different to the many visitors that come and, get to their aquarium or utilize much of that space. So I think your analysis, I would like to see, what your findings are along those areas and how those findings begin to inform how you've literally shaped this area. And particularly, I just discussed where are a lot of these people coming from. Some drive. You just mentioned that there's kind of like an overflow of parking within the immediate adjacent area. There's lots of parking garages. So when visitors arrive or anyone arrive to the downtown area, more than likely they'll park in one of those garages and then, cross Pratt Street and get to the development. So what is that experience like? It's very different to another group of users who arrive by public transportation. Where are those key elements related to the transit realm? The bus stops. We know there's a bus stop very adjacent to Light, between Light and Calvert. There's a series of bus stops there. How is that now beginning to influence the decisions you make in terms of accessing your project? One of the key point of access. There's a lot of foot traffic up and down Calvert Street, mainly for folks who will get into this area by transit, by train, using the metro. Yet again, I'm not necessarily seeing any sort of gesture to begin to acknowledge that in any way. So I think these are just some of the things in my mind that I'd like to see brought out and better clarified. More than likely, you would have done that already. I'm hoping that you did. And, but we would like to see that as well. Um, and then I discussed through my questions related to this, the shoreside program, everything that's landside versus the program that's on the water. And I think your questions, your responses kind of address that, so I won't comment on that anymore. But the one area again that I would like to well, two areas. The first relates to navigating the spaces between the buildings. And it's kind of like an extension. So you arrive at the site, you've got these nodes that kind of set up how you get in and get out. But then you get into the site and you kind of work your way around these buildings. And I think the two mixed use or residential buildings, there are certain things that are beginning to happen there that are a little bit unique. You're making a deliberate effort to not block the views to the harbor. And kind of as you work your way past these buildings, you get in a bit of a Pearson view towards the constellation. So I think all that's great. The one building or the one site that I'm still having a bit of trouble with is the site that's defined as the sail. And I get it, you're utilizing a portion of that building and site to define the view sheds, that come in from Calvert and from South Street. But, and I think maybe the way the building is sculpted is a little bit contrary to what I'm actually expecting at the Inner Harbor, certainly at that kind of as a major anchor point to the site. And just looking at it here, look at how the building kind of just follows the intended curve, as you navigate that edge. I don't know that that actually is helping you much because as you walk in, let's say from World Trade Center and you kind of working your way around to go to the residential buildings, that corner of the building is beginning to really compete with what I consider to be a very important inflection point in the site. It's changing directions, and there's a lot of collection of activities that are occurring there. So I would probably want to see that open up a little bit more and just soften that kind of a transition, as you navigate around that area. And then finally, very quickly, the whole idea of the character of the site. And, and maybe this is just an unfortunate piece of advancing the architecture of the buildings without fully exploring and expressing what the intentions of the master plan need to be. And I get the feeling just looking at it, don't get me wrong, it's wonderful, but there's a kind of, it's beginning to take on a kind of air of exclusivity. And I'm a little bit concerned about that, to the extent where a lot of the precedents that you shared, they're all great precedents and they're all successful projects in their own right. But I didn't see any sort of precedents that are more local other than the one in DC. You go just a couple of blocks east, you go up to Fells Point. How come we didn't talk about that? It seems to me that's more authentic than anything you show simply because it is local, it is present, it is evolving. There are mistakes there, but these are things that I think you can tap into and share with us in terms of have us relate. So I think that's just an opportunity missed, and maybe you did look at it, but I think again that's something you ought to just share with us. I do welcome, the idea of paying homage to the freedom legacy and the heritage. I think it creates a wonderful anchor and it contributes again to the authenticity of what the project can be. But so I think on that sense, it's good. The air of exclusivity that concerns me a bit, mainly because in my mind, Baltimore is not chic. It's a kind of a gritty area. It's blue collar. Its history stands for itself. And I think we can argue and we can present ideas of inclusivity and building equitably, but it has to be a little bit more than just celebrating that cultural heritage. uh, Things need to be more welcoming, and there's got to be it's almost as if you need to expand it beyond just the idea of memorializing the past, so to speak. I think a couple of ways to do that certainly is in the program, in terms of the uses and the intended users. There's got to be a way to kind of better integrate a lot of that so folks can navigate the waterfront area, kind of knowing that they're doing it with a sense of pride of place, which in my mind really comes from more from a balanced representation of what the true cultural tapestry of Baltimore is. So I think with that, that's going to help you to define the more unique nature of your project so that it's truly centered on Baltimore and it doesn't appear as if, well, portions of the project can be seen or experienced in other parts of the world. If I go to Copenhagen, it's there. There's a little bit of that here now in Baltimore. So you've got to be a little bit careful about that and stay true to what I consider to be the real elements that define authenticity and bring the uniqueness of Baltimore to your project. I'll stop there, Pavlina.
Thank you, Osborne. Appreciate it. I would like to move. I'll come around and see if any of the thoughts come at the end. I'd like to hear from Sharon next. Sharon, please share your thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, just a few. I agree with a lot of what Osborne has said. And to go back to that park, the park at Freedomsport, I think it is a great opportunity to do just as Osborne is saying, is have that welcoming feature with the materiality and the history truly reflected as the identity of Baltimore, and that's your key point, and your first opportunity to do that. I think you're well on your way, just in its forms. I think the way it's designed so far conceptually There's a great sense of arrival there, almost a sense of relief as you make your way through the density of the city and you arrive at this point. And it's truly special, and it's a truly meaningful arrival point that welcomes you in, especially with the framed views, the organic forms, the sculpting of the topography that not only frames the views, but it also offers areas of respite and human scaled spaces, as you described. I think it's very successful in that way. And then the way you handle the education piece, the history piece, the materiality to get, again, to that true Baltimore identity is going to be some key next steps in that space. I'd also echo Osborne's points about bringing the same level of attention and consideration to your other arrival points all the way around the entire project area, so that every entrance is meaningful and clear and offers visual cues that tell you that you've arrived at this special space. So we're looking forward to seeing the development of those in other areas of the project. I think the idea of programming the harbor, the water space as if the water is part of the park, I think is great. I'm looking forward to seeing how that develops. But I would just caution you to be careful of over programming the harbor so that it becomes unpleasant to be on, to simply, if it can be overcrowded. And if you want that sense of freedom and joy in the harbor for everybody, there'll have to be some moderation, as you described, that you're going to be looking at. So the level to which you go with that, I think, will be important to measure and make sure that's moderated. I think the landscape topologies can be tremendously successful as you've described them, because it sounds like you're already thinking about the necessary infrastructure to support them successfully, like soil volumes and so forth. So I'm optimistic that these typologies are really going to speak and be meaningful parts of the project. And I'm assuming that they will be featured and showcased as educational items as well, so that this project is a passive and active education experience about landscape topologies, about flood mitigation and climate change. There's a lot of opportunity for education here. So hopefully that gets integrated as part of this implementation of these various typologies and climatic management. Something, as I said in my question portion, that I'm looking forward to seeing also is the development of the vehicular and pedestrian relationships and how those are working together. Hopefully we'll see that in the next round. And a more complete picture of the entire project area, not only the ports of entry as we've mentioned, but all of it. How are all the pieces tying together to each other and to the surrounding city? So what are those linkages across the entire project area? And then one final thing is, you're creating a very interesting set of flood mitigation management techniques here. And so I'll be curious to hear what those maintenance protocols might be, because if you've raised the upper promenade to be flood resilient, naturally you expect with that acceptable risk calculation that you've done, that some of those lower levels will be submerged at times. And what is the maintenance protocol to make sure 10 years after it's constructed, it's not going to look like it's starting to degrade as a result of that. So those will be interesting things for us to see as you develop this further. I believe that's all of my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharon. Kevin, what are your thoughts for the team?
Thanks. I have a lot of thoughts, and probably going to jump around a little bit because I've been taking notes and not all in great order, so bear with me. I want to start with what I love about this. I just want to commend the team on this really wonderful, clear, thoughtful presentation. I mean, it was just really thoughtful and a lot of detail, and I really was able to sort of fully understand your vision, I think. And I think especially the public realm and landscape description, Claire and your team, it's just varied and sophisticated, and it's a place I can really imagine wanting to be. So I just think that a lot of really great moves, and the public realm is generous. This notion of recapturing space from cars for people, And Vaki, the way you presented this sort of foundational framework, like just with this simple, continuing the street grids, and it's just such a simple and fundamental way of thinking about where the parcels are going to be subdivided. I think that this, it aligns with best practices that we see in all kinds of waterfront development, and it just seems like a really great foundational starting point. So I love your precedents. I think you're looking at a lot of great things. And I just think like this notion of even just going all in on the light and the light street and reconception is just a huge gesture to connecting back to the city, and just the immense benefits that will come with that. I think are probably it's even hard to imagine at this point. So and I think that the connections to the water are great. Like the idea of no guard, like even now the details of thinking about no guardrails on the water are fantastic. I want to say like a big thank you to the big shade idea. Just like having that as a generator for urban public life and public realm is just it's just so underutilized, I think, in lots of recent redevelopment projects. So the idea of just having that front and center, I think, is amazing. And and all the invitations to linger, the incorporation of commemoration, I think all of these things are just super great. Like, and the in-water activation is also fascinating. It's kind of democratization of the waterfront. So all these things, I found very impressive and inspiring. So I want to see all this happen and work in this very generous public realm. It takes a lot of maintenance and upkeep and programming and organization. And I'm not an expert in the question I'm about to ask, but like can 900 residential units and that office build, like is there enough there to kind of sustain it? And we all know that like the mixed use element here is key, and bringing residents and life and 24/7 activity. So it's almost like because I was looking at the wharf, and the wharf has I think it has something like 1,500 units and 4 hotels and like a destination music venue that kind of gives it this life and activation. And like you showed Marina Bay in Singapore, and that has like 10,000, it has like thousands. So I guess I would almost, and then maybe sort of looking at your plan, like physically the plan just seems to me to be very logical and makes so much sense. But I guess my question then is about like the site with the sale building. Just wondering if there's a way to maybe think about more residential or a hotel or something else incorporated onto that site that can kind of again just infuse the project with more 24/7 in eyes on the plazas and people coming in and out, and more sort of things not shutting down in the evening. And so I would just argue for more. Like I just think that to really maximize the success here and to sustain the amount of retail you're showing, and to actually have an opportunity for some retail that is a little bit more neighborhood serving, that stays open a little bit later, and it's not just destination retail and that kind of thing. So I just think that is just something, again, like I'm sure you've looked at it and you're penciling out what's possible and all of that. But I just feel like the key to this is just going to be really kind of like the amount of infusion of people like there 24/7, right? And even thinking out of the box a little bit. Like one of the interesting things at the wharf is how they incorporated the houseboat community into the wharf, and just sort of enable that to kind of be another little place where there's just people and activity, and it's a little bit odd but interesting, right? And so I don't know if there's a culture of that at all in Baltimore, but is there a way of thinking about any of the adapting any of the existing docks to kind of maybe invite that? That could be another way to get a small different kind of community in there. So anyways, just residences, and more residences just seems like a great thing. So now maybe moving along to like the design of the open spaces and the promenade. I just think that I just love this, this multiple sort of level, the multi-level, the choices, the in-water activation. I would just maybe suggest that that the generosity and the scale isn't always the most important. Like I think I wouldn't be afraid of going a little bit narrower sometimes if you need to, like this intensity and again, going back to the wharf because everyone knows it, it's in some cases it's something like 60 to 70 feet total, and it feels really good, right? And I think some of that is you can achieve some of that here, for example, by maybe even thinking about smaller scale pavilions on the water side of the promenade, for example, for a small place to get a drink, or a little pavilion for shade, like that image you had in the Marina Bay, those little sort of shade pavilion loges. Just different things that invitations, kind of that 1 minute, every 1 minute you have something interesting to stop and see and walk, and really kind of not being afraid to fill in that wharf with other draws. I think that going to go back to the sale building. So this is, again, like, this is kind of the thing that like worries me a little bit, because I feel like it's, as an the architect in me, like, I'm super interested. It looks really, really like a neat idea. And this kind of scooping, kind of terraced outdoor spaces looking over the park. I kind of like love the imagination behind it. But on the urbanist side of me is sort of saying, this runs the risk of being a little bit gimmicky or a kind of white elephant in 20 years, in the same way that kind of like the festival marketplace became a white elephant, and just, it's sort of an idea that kind of is dependent on the vagaries of whatever kind of retail experience that happens to be working right now. It's not as flexible of a building type. And it just makes me wonder, it's hard even in, it's hard in Hong Kong to get retail on the 6th floor to work. So it's like, this is Baltimore. So I'm just wondering, like, about the logistics and the reality of that building type, and wondering if there's something else that, that again might incorporate hotel or residential, or maybe sort of a, rooftop performance venue, or just something that's a little bit, a building that sort of is more future proofed and maybe adaptable if things aren't working out. This to me seems like a very specific, it's almost too specific at this early stage of a master plan to commit to, in my opinion. So that's just something that I think should be looked at closely. I mentioned the parking earlier. I would hate to see like the sale building be the place where we actually haven't done. It's too hard to deal with parking because it compromises the public realm, or it's technically too difficult to kind of go below and still get trees. And then suddenly we end up with a big parking garage on this site with maybe a tower above or something like that. I would hate to see that happen. And I think dealing with the parking like right away is just really, really important. And again, I don't think, I love that you took on the plan from a people and public space first perspective and not just from a parking perspective. So I think that that's fantastic. But at some point, like, it has to be confronted. And I think it's going to change a lot. And you can't just do if you do a podium above, on your residential parcel, then you don't have like that nice, opening up slot of, public space, and it completely changes all of that. So, and if you go below, then you're obviously compromising the soil volumes and all of that. So there's something you've got to give. And I think it would be a shame to see like this amazing vision kind of get whittled away by some of these realities. Let's see. I'm actually less concerned about the overlap of pedestrian and vehicular movements that I think have been expressed by a few people. I mean, I think you're looking at great precedents, and there's ways to make that work. A lot of it's operational. A lot of it is like material choices. And I think sometimes more complicated traffic flows, like that thing around Conway, and those are actually good. Like it's good that means that the vehicles like move slow, and they're more, uncertain about where they're supposed to go, and consequently drive slower. And that's better for this sort of shared roadway experience. So I think, and the more you rationalize that, then the faster people go, and like they will speed through the yellow light and then hit a pedestrian. So I think that the idea of this kind of more nuanced ins and outs and cobblestone paths, and you're not quite sure if you go this, that thing, that's, a good thing. And that's kind of and that works quite well at the wharf, frankly, where people aren't quite sure if they're supposed to drive there or not. Let's see. Oh yeah, and then the last thing is the World Trade Center again. So I think that, you're right, it's an opportunity because they've had flooding issues and resilience issues, but like, what does that mean? Like, what is the opportunity there at the ground floor? How does it integrate into the public realm everywhere else? Can the ground floor be adapted or thought of in a different way? I just encourage you to look at that. I don't know the building in detail myself, other than that it's a pay building that's had flooding, but the fact that it's so close to those really, interesting in-water amenities and different level of the boardwalk, I just think there could be something there that it just seemed like it wasn't kind of as integrally thought as some of the other elements. And then across the bay on the riprap side, is there an opportunity there to kind of make a more robust, soft edge that really showcases kind of, filtration and sort of upgrading kind of the ecology, and sort of showcasing the idea of trying to improve the cleanliness of the water for these in-water activities. I don't know if it involves oysters or what, all these kind of different ways that people are looking at sort of, telling the story of improved ecosystems and environmental sustainability. I think I'll stop there. I think that we kind of rambling for a little too long, but thank you very much. It was a really, really interesting presentation.
Thank you for your comments, Kevin. I'm gonna probably start. I have them grouped by took notes during the landscape presentation, and then sort of the more three-dimensional, the vertical portion with the buildings and whatnot. I'm going to start with that and sort of work backwards. I'm a little bit less enthusiastic than Kevin about the very framework that was established here. And it's everything I suspected from the first presentation. I was just wanting to hear, because we had those arrows extending the streets in the very first presentation too. And I wanted to hear more about what else, outside of that. And I think, Vaki, in your presentation, when you were pulling us through some of this, you used the words obvious several times, and at one point it became sort of intuitive, and it was about this idea of like, yeah, it's no brainer. Like right now the pavilions are short, right, but they're so long as a facade that they're blocking views, and so all of that impetus to really open up the view sheds is a no-brainer. It is the obvious sort of solution. So much so that even when the pavilions came with their previous owner for, redo a few years ago, we were pushing very hard at the UDAAP presentation to make them more porous, to open up like through views through them, because they were having a hard time filling them up with retail anyway. So why have it so solid, blow them out, have people move, frame those views? So I think all that is absolutely commendable. I think this diagram alone, in terms of try to create, if not physical connections, at least visual connections through it to the water, is absolutely indisputable as an important underpinning of the project. From there, however, where I start to really have an issue, and I think you would hear it from different people in different ways, is this very, what you called obvious, and then I would add to that predictable thing of like, okay, we've created these arrows that extend from the existing streets, therefore we must make building parcels out of them and fill them with building. This is where I think something that you consider obvious and therefore no brainer and like, let's run with it, is where I think your design stopped, and where you thinking about what's possible here really got hindered. And I think that this is the conversation about, had this come back in August to the panel, we would have had a lot of great conversation, and who knows, maybe we would have ended exactly where you are. But I'm starting to doubt the fact that there was actually a robust study of what else could possibly happen here, other than take this piece of land, extend the arrows, and make buildings in the spaces between the arrows. I think you would see, I think there's a little bit of an intellectual and philosophical issue with that, because it is so obvious and predictable. But I think you would hear a lot of people really question that, because unlike a lot of the examples that you're showing, where you're reclaiming brownfields and sort of post-industrial wasteland, and maybe the rational approach in squares and getting to 128 story from code and whatever perspective, we know why development is driven to that particular form making, to that particular scale. I think when it comes to this here, is you're inheriting a once successful, now failing commercial development that sits amid what many refer to sort of as a public park, so to speak. Whether it's park-like, everyone will argue, it's seen better days. It felt better 10 years ago. Even in the last 10 years, it's deteriorated completely. So there's no doubt that anything you're proposing is many times infinitely better than, in terms of quality, and if it gets executed to this level of finishing, much, much better. But you're not inheriting sort of the industrial wasteland that now needs to be gridded, and it needs to be sort of maxed out in terms of development. I think even for those who say we don't want residential on the water, that this is sort of like the far extent of that. But if you say, no, we want to build more density because we're looking for an economically sustainable model for the current times and hopefully for another 30 years, then we need to bring that level of density. I think there's still a level of critical thinking that needs to be involved here that says, like, should we just grid it up and fill it up with buildings and try to find pro forma for each site that works? Or should we actually still consider that this could be this open park-like public space on the water that is introducing all of these, density pieces that can help bring more people there, but also start to anchor it. What I'm saying is like, just because the wharf did this and all these other things, doesn't mean that you know, you absolutely have to do the exact same thing here, you know. And it became the most obvious to me. Here's where it became obvious to me. I suspected that that's the whole thing. It's like, let's make parcels out of this and let's build buildings there. And then let's preserve the corner there because it sort of preserves the views for the towers that are on the other side, which is why we're seeing that 3D view from someone's office, you know, sweeping, you know, down the middle. It is predictable. It is obvious. And it is very predictable. And like I said, maybe it's the best solution, but we'll never know because it's not really interrogated, analyzed, and studied, you know, to the degree to where we can sit comfortably and say, like, yeah, that works. The one I have to say, there's this one building, and it's not the sale, that even in the very first presentation pointed in my mind that we're just filling the space with buildings. And it is that little office building that is sitting between the sale and the World Trade Center. There's something about it that, as we know, office right now is probably the most questionable program in terms of remote working and all that sort of stuff. And, you know, it seems like the building that has the least programmatic value when we talk about, you were talking about like was it the quality of the space? I took note of how you interpreted the character of the space, that the character of the space is its program, its function, its use. And right now, office is such an inert program, right? There's people that come to work and then they leave at a certain point, and there's a building, maybe we can keep the lights on at night so it doesn't look totally dark. But even the ground plane, it's hollowed out because I think someone is thinking here, it's like, no, we actually need more space for people to move and arrive and all that sort of. So that's the one building that's always felt to me in your composition about, it felt like a space filler, like something that we must build more buildings. You know, yes, we need to generate revenue and like all of that. So my question is, in your studies, can that be office space absorbed in new high density building in some sort of fashion, kind of maybe it becomes more, you know, kind of vertical urbanism, and you mix even more programs there so that you don't feel like you have to fill the space on the ground with buildings. I think this is the difference. Where is it blocks of buildings, the way the space is rationalized, or is it a park that has these different kind of, be it very dense moments in there? If you look at the stretch of the whole promenade, you will find out very quickly, you know, and maybe we can jump to the very first diagram you had, the very first one that had like the inner harbor, like with the exclamation mark. The rationale of that whole sequence that we're looking at here. So we have Harbor East, right there. We have Harbor Point, which is, you know, developing its public space now too. So those are the only ones that are sort of gridded for this current level, high density housing and, you know, hotel and commercial kind of development. And then if you follow a bunch of the rest, is sort of like these pavilions that are on the piers and along the water that are south of Pratt Street. And as you turn the corner around, you know, that establish this edge, right? The urban edge, and then these different buildings that are happening in the park. So there's a philosophical question that's worth asking. And I wonder to what degree that was discussed, debated, or even studied in the team, that has to do with how do we want this to read? Do we want it to read as a public open space with high density pieces in there? Or is it really truly this simply extending the city grid all the way to the edge of the promenade? I think it's an important distinction. And right now, if I look at the plan, you know, it's leaning more towards like filling up the grid, extending it. And especially now that, you know, some of even these view sheds are becoming more vehicular based. It seems like, and it was commented earlier, that the edge of development of just city, just urbanity and building is coming right up to the promenade. I think I questioned that. I wonder if a similar thing can be accomplished. Yes, to the density, yes, to the variety of buildings, perhaps consolidating the ground plane a little bit more so that you're not robbing this sense of openness and, you know, being on the water. I think there was a comment earlier that was said about like the big water experiences, about like us owning our water and all of that. I'd be careful about like this over colonization, I would call it, but I think Sharon talked about it as well, of, you know, at what point is it too much? Yes, you want activity, you want things to happen, they're happening in the right place. You still have a complete promenade to work with. Does it all need to crash right there? But it's also like an overall attitude of like, really just owning every piece of view or surface or activity around there. There's something about just being on the water in the city that a lot of urban parks that aren't featured here around the US and elsewhere accomplish very successfully with high density, immediately integrated and either right up to the edge or integrated in it. I think it's worth looking at some of those examples. We get the wharfs and we get some of these other post-industrial developments on the water. This isn't quite it. It's not the quite exact parallel to those. There's other projects that I think can help reinforce that. So there's another image later on to the site plan that's called master plan. And I think that's where you start to see it a little bit more obvious. Some of my early notes here when Claire was presenting, or it was probably a mixture of you, the big shade, the big water, and the marshland. Maybe you, Vaki, walked us through those, and then Claire jumped into the details of that. They're wonderful. I think similar to like opening the view sheds, nobody will say no to shade. Nobody will say no to access to water. They're commendable. We all agree and love the fact that they're important to the project. But then are you really making that happen? So I look at this plan, and for a moment, I have to disregard all of the 5-6 rows of trees that are rimming the streets, only for a moment, because that is one intervention. And, everyone's still questioning the reality of this kind of street condition, if it can actually handle all of the traffic that is now geared towards it. I'm gonna stop, kind of exclude that for a moment, and start to see how very little actually green space is available in this idea of like big green, right? And I think it can be big green from the attitude of, yes, we want to plant tree everywhere we can, versus I really am in this very lush green natural landscape that has like kind of these pieces of the city being pulled in that live in this park, right? As opposed to, here are my blocks, here's where the buildings will be. LA, come and design the spaces in between them so that they can feel more humane and more natural. I commend landscape on doing the best they could with whatever they're given, but I think there's a difference in this particular case of who's driving the planning and kind of the master planning of the place, whether it's, architect and developer trying to make building blocks out of this and then filling the spaces in between with landscape versus, and there's plenty of examples of planners, landscape architects driving the planning process where it's sort of considered as a continuous kind of natural environment where the urban edges are defined and where the buildings find their appropriate boundaries. I hope that as you continue to converse, and if any of these lines you've drawn are at all flexible, that you would open up the conversation between the disciplines in a way that that they really start to inform each other. And I don't want, let's not look at the park for a moment. Let's look at the rendering that is showing the condition between the residential building and the waterfront. This will segue into other things that I wanted to talk about with respect to just scale program, the experience that's happening there. This is the one in between, so we'll get to this and the driving, and I think you need to render this with cars. Like the ones that are idling all the way down there where the turnaround is and whatnot. So we'll get to that. Can we get to the rendering that has the residential buildings? I think Kevin spoke on it earlier. Yes, that one. Yeah. So, this is the area down below kind of the densest building, and there's no doubt in anyone's mind that this feels like a very hard, solid surface that perhaps there'll be planters, perhaps there'll be some trees that come and, I commend the idea of like adding as much soil volume as possible. So at one point you can get volume and you can really start to create that big shade you're talking about. But this is one of the many images that shows that this is still a very much kind of urban edge simply extending all the way to the promenade and really starting to just add trees wherever there's space for them. I think it's a fundamentally different concept than working, with the open space as it is now. Imagine, the pavilions are gone, and really working from a space that is habitable, that is actually softer, that is more natural, so that you can support that big green and the marshland idea a little bit closer. I think this particular image started to point to me certain things that Osborne was perhaps talking about in a slightly different way, but there are examples in Baltimore when you go to the other mixed-use developments that are currently ongoing. Harbor East is mostly built out, but Harbor Point still develops and, has their own big green, coming up for construction. And there is precedent very locally about how these high density, high rises of residential with commercial on the bottom are actually faring from an urban design perspective. The area that has the little roundabout with all of the hotels and residential buildings that are there, where the Four Seasons is and all that, has been fully built out now for at least 10 years. So you can really start to feel what an environment like that looks like, and it's like right on the water. And it's an example where the buildings are pushed up and built up completely right to the edge of the promenade. And the streets are only wide enough to have some sidewalk, right, and the buildings in between them. And I have to tell you, it's not the greatest urban space to be in. And for the majority of the time, it's pretty empty. Like, nobody really wants to be there. And as far as the promenade is concerned, it's sort of people walk along it, and there's restaurants there that open up to the promenade that, good enough restaurateurs try to activate so that they become kind of the alive area. But then those streets in between and these areas of the high rises, because they sort of just hit the ground, are mostly inert, they're just vacant. There's like retail and stuff like that there. So I'm asking here, if this isn't a post-game Sunday flooded with thousands of visitors, and which we hope, will happen, what does this place feel like if we don't have the crowds to actually fill up this hardscaped area and all of these different seating areas and all of that? Would anyone want to be here? Would anyone want to walk through it? Would you want to hang out on a Tuesday, even if it's like after work or something like that? There's something about the scale, yes to density and yes to size, but there's something about the scale, and this is what Osborne was mentioning, that you're missing, and it's in that, kind of first, I would say 50 feet of these buildings, that feels like, oh, I'm expecting thousands of visitors every day, so therefore I need this kind of architecture and this kind of retail and this kind of space to really accommodate them. But it would become sort of the issue of lack of intimacy, of lack of belonging, of lack of being there, that will forever not attract, your residents, sort of the people that live a few blocks away or something like that. There's got to be a right balance of how much is this built for the tourists and the visitors, knowing that they will come, and we want everybody here, and we want people to rediscover Baltimore and this wonderful investment and promenade. But it also has to be about, this still needs to feel like somebody's city, like somebody's place. If it's only a block away from where other people live or work, it has to feel inviting to that. It has to have a scale that works for people for the times when you don't have the masses here. Yeah, in this particular case, that was kind of another big red flag for me, was that there's like the promenade that is all about movement, right? There's nowhere to be. The plan of this office building had just elevators and circulation and then a little bit of space, lobby space along Pratt Street. But now there's like this vast paved area underneath it. Like, what would that feel like on a regular day if you don't have hundreds of people like that filling it? And then going further and further into the project that is simply pushing you along this path of travel. The promenade is there. It's facilitating this multi-level movement. It's great. But it's like, where are we actually arriving? Where do people want to be? What would people actually do there? If it's not, shopping Sunday or like after a game or something like that. I think there's a level of ground plane thinking that needs to happen that would also scale and ground the project beyond the big scale thinking, beyond the like let's put the big buildings and do square footage takeoffs there. So I think there's a moment of reflection that needs to happen here, of at what point is this really about, let's get as much building on the ground as possible while maintaining the view shed corridors and the access to the water, versus can we consolidate some of this program? I can see that office space finding its way into the sale. I can see that office space finding itself into the towers, just so that we can free up the ground plane, give it a little bit more breathing space. And if you go to the very first diagrams where the big green was drawn, or big shade, you can see that vision. There was a vision about this is an open space, an extension of the water. And then there's these volumes and objects that are really starting to activate it. And let's see, there's another one that had it. Can you go one forward before that? This is the existing one. There was a plan that was showing the building sitting in the middle of there it is. Yeah, that one. So if you look at an image like that, that image communicates a very connected tissue. It communicates something that is fundamentally open. It's a ground plane. It's connected. It's green. It's soft. It has all these different things through it, but it's an extension of the water and that feeling of being connected to the natural elements of this urban environment. And then there's sort of like these objects existing in it. There's more space between them. The views are preserved, but it doesn't feel like they're simply sort of crashing onto each other. I really urge you to consider this vision. I think it's something that starts to differentiate this from all other wharfs, that are designed, and B, it starts to almost evolve the idea of this open urban park that's on the water that is now starting to integrate a higher density productive program, that can fund the redevelopment and stuff like that, and try to be a little bit less kind of on this obvious, formulaic, more predictable path of development. I think there's room for innovation here that can happen on top of some of the things that you consider successful as models. And I think it's worth exploring it. And I think the key is within that connective tissue of the ground level and those first few levels of the buildings, as well as their proportions and the way they're filling the site. So that's my biggest ask, is to really reconsider that office building there, reconsider the space available around it. I think the sale building, and it's whether it's gimmicky or not, whether it's iconic enough and whatnot, simply needs room to breathe. It just needs to be experienced as a sculptural kind of there's there moment. Right now it's wedged in between an office building, and maybe a wonderful memorial park, and it fails to really deliver on this iconic moment that you really are hoping for it to accomplish. It's simply competing with a more generic piece of architecture that is crowding it on one side, and a very tall and powerful piece on the other, and you need the space around it to really be able to hold it all together. My concern about the vehicular access to the buildings remains only on the level of, we typically see that figured out before you promise sort of offices and apartments and like all that kind of stuff, because you want this to work and you want it to work well. So I think it's important to really step on the pedal and really resolve it in a meaningful way. And I think it will be important to see it with some definition in the next presentation, and with some commitment as well. And I think with that comes the parking also. I agree, as it stands and as you've designed the buildings, there's no way to wrap apartments around parking in the tower, so it's not happening. We'll probably extend kind of the podium to become more full, bigger. It will modify the building quite a bit. If it is in the ground, then that will start to really affect the ground plane. So I think that's a very important piece that needs resolution. And similar to that are all of these access points for services. If we go to the plan that shows that a little bit, I'd like to offer some thoughts on it. I think trying to minimize the amounts of that vehicular access obviously will be very helpful. I think right now you have the one to the very south of the building. You have another one, I believe, where that other commercial building is as well. Can all that be consolidated where you already have kind of the roundabout drive-in, considering that Conway is the area where people will actually be flowing. I know, Adam, you were at the charrettes of that particular area, and we're all discussing how important kind of the access from Conway is and how that streetscape needs to be improved so that as people are coming from the stadiums along there, there's like this really continuous experience down to the water. I really question whether that's the right place to really pair it with the service drive. Can that be accomplished in the area where you're already pulling up cars for drop off? I'm a little bit about the drop and knowing human here. Yes, police is that there. People will be pulling up and staying there indefinitely. I question whether you need to really bring vehicles that deep into the site and have them idle and queue, and what the quality of your retail on each side will be if that is the case. It's different if cars are just passing at a low speed. It's absolutely different if they're just standing there idling with engines on. And I think a lot of this needs further thought. It needs further illustration, not in the fully rendered stuff. It can be very kind of in the white model, but it's the kind of things that need to start being seen and scrutinized a little bit more. As it stands right now, there's like 3 perforations there through a very short area along, both the multi-lane passageway and the pedestrian way. So I think that's really high on the priority. I think apart from what the buildings look like, a lot of these things really need to work really well and be considered in context with everything else. My last few comments are related to the work of the landscape team, and I'll second the comments. It's very thoughtful, and it's in a way also very pragmatic. We've seen proposals for different portions, starting all the way from Port Covington and the Under Armour headquarters, and all the way through this area. There was proposals from the aquarium. There was conversations before all the way into the Canton Promenade and stuff like that, about how to treat the bulkhead, how to improve it, how to replace it. And of course, there's been a lot of proposals about this natural edge. Everyone loves the idea of removing the constructed bulkhead and really allowing for this natural marsh-like landscape to flow in. And perhaps, Claire, maybe that's what you were describing as like, it will take 50 years to really build that fully and have it fully functioning. So from that point of view, I'm thinking that the proposal you're putting forth is probably the most practical one that I've heard from all of these years, in the sense that it rebuilds the existing bulkhead, it extends it vertically, and then starts to introduce these varied additional kind of extensions, so to speak, that start to enhance and introduce kind of more richness on the water's edge, that can be built much quicker and much sooner. So I'm very much encouraged by that. Maybe finally we will see an upgrade to the promenade, and it will happen here. And I think there's a lot of really sort of simple, level-headed thinking about it, but also a lot of richness in the approach and the kind of spaces that it will create. And I'm leaving kind of the floating swim islands for the future. Hopefully water cleans up far enough to where that becomes viable, but I'm sort of reviewing the overall approach outside of that. I was very much encouraged by the approach, kind of to the various landscape spaces created, but I can't help but think that there's merely trying to make sense. And like it was mentioned earlier, there's that drive, and there'll be like really good landscape architecture there. And I feel like it's used right now, the landscape design, as a mitigating tool for some of the conditions that are created between the buildings, rather than the other way around, of really starting to think about what a wonderful continuous kind of lush green shaded big water, big shade marshland space this can be, and how that integrates with the buildings. And I really hope that as this develops further, the team will open up a little bit more interaction between these things, and perhaps we can see some possibilities of how that can be enhanced. I think we keep seeing images of that one park there in the middle, and that's if the street realignment works out and whatnot. It will be such a wonderful space. It will be such a wonderful gesture. The fact that it's found kind of its new dedication as a memorial is really also wonderful, and a great way to celebrate the history of the place. But you can't just hang your hat on that. I think whether that space happens in this particular version or not, the success of the rest of it, where all these buildings are landing, really relies on how well you design and articulate the space in between, and what character and quality do you give to this. Is it a sea of pavement with trees sticking out of it, or is it really that big green, big water kind of space that is integrated with architecture? That would be the big question moving forward. The only last thing I would say is, as we look at this overall drawing, is that it also strikes me that, and you kind of have to look at it with respect to the rest of the waterfront development, that so much about the spaces you've created between the buildings are just about movement. I think there's probably some gathering kind of happening at the park there along the water's edge, and sort of how it was illustrated in the render. There's obviously moments to pause along the promenade and sort of look at the water or hang out there on the edge and interact. But everything has the same geometry when it comes to the exterior space. It's linear and it's about movement. And yes, you can stop and do something if you'd like, but there really isn't a, so to speak, a gathering space or a destination. And as much as this would be beautiful and shiny and new, I feel the team needs to still ask the question, where is there? Where is that really emblematic moment? Is it the sail building? And if so, how does it sit in the landscape, and how it presents itself from all these different angles is extremely important. Is it the new mixed-use tower with all of these areas that are outside cascading into the water? Is that where the outdoor dining would be? Where is, where can you sit and have a meal and look at the water? It's really important. How is it scaled? Is it scaled for crowds? Is it scaled for the everyday? And then finally, kind of that space in the middle there, it's creating a little bit of a retail alley between the pink and the red. And how does that relate to, again, being able to really extend, like, see the water, engage with the water? Is it just an afterthought? Who goes there? It's not connected to any other circulation. So there's like sort of questions to ask into the plan, even as conceived, that we're still not sure how it would exactly function for the different users for the different times of the day. So let's see, there's the last item here that was discussed from the landscape presentation is sort of this idea of vitality and activation. And I think it's really important, because that was where we were discussing later on, is like how much of the programming is actually necessary and working. And what's really exciting here is to see that every time there's sort of like a pier sticking into the water, people tend to want to engage with it. And I'm imagining that some of the swim islands could potentially be that. But knowing that those are elements that are further down the road, like something that could happen, or could not happen, and it won't be immediate, it really begs the question of what are other ways really realistically to activate things in a way that is not overbearing, in a way that's not overpowering, something that can actually happen there in the next 10 years. If, say, the clean water is 20 years from now, the swimmable water. So I think this is still very much on the table, beyond the kind of the retail on the bottom, so the retail heavy approach to the overall design. What else is there to do? I think it's really important to ask that, and it's a rhetorical question, but I think it's one that is worth really continuing to ask. What will bring people here, as opposed to them sitting on the big lawn that's facing the water over there in Harbor Point. So those are the kind of questions, as we wrap up, that are both kind of big picture, but also they actually get really granular, and they're related. To bring people here, to keep them here, the ones that come every day, the ones that live around, and the ones that visit, it kind of needs this really big picture thinking, and it kind of needs this really granular. It needs to work and create, all of these different moments. And I'm hoping that in the next level of presentation that we'll see, now that we fully understand your initial approach, perhaps it's less about the kind of the rendered views, and it's a lot more about, let's make all of these spaces that right now you're highlighting with the pink there, right size them, program them in a right way, really discuss how they interact between the landscape and the architecture and the water. This is really the level of scrutiny we want to take on the master plan level, so that, as many have said before, some of these concepts and attitudes and goals are baked into the master plan. So they're not trying to mitigate it through architecture, be it landscape or building architecture, but they're actually baked as a matter of philosophy and as a matter of scale and proportion. That's the extent of my thoughts. I want to see if there's anything else to add. Osborne, Sharon, and Kevin, any additional thoughts that came to mind as you were listening to the rest?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate, and I think I made this comment at the previous presentation. I kind of talked around it a little bit here, but just so much emphasis on the water side, as in facing the water. I really believe there's a lot happening at the street edge, and we really need to see a lot more of that. So I'm hoping in the next iteration, there could be a lot more views, as Pavlina pointed out, ground level views that begin to tell the story of how the project actually meets the street. Thanks.
Thanks, Osborne. Anything else, Kevin, Sharon?
Yeah, I just think I really appreciated all your comments, Toby. I think we've kind of given the team a bit of, it's a little bit of a challenge in terms of like from the high level conceptual approach. I mean, there's an idea of buildings in a park, more object buildings in a park, and then there's like a more urban edge waterfront. Right? There are two different typologies. Yeah. I would argue that like for the past 40 years we have been interrogating the object in the park version, and then like the World Trade Center is like a vestige of that approach, and like a lot of our cities like Hartford or Jacksonville that don't have this great connection with the water, it's if that isn't handled just right, it's a trickier thing to pull off, I think, in a lot of cities that have shown us that, and I think if you look at places like Vancouver and places like that where there is like an active engagement with the water from the citizenry, and it's very easy, it's not really a mystery. Like we understand how that happens, and that often is sometimes, it often is this kind of like embracing and going with the urban fabric of the city. And I think that, I guess there could be another approach where they said, we actually want the most lush park here, and it's about that. But I guess then, one could then interrogate that and sort of say, maybe being in the crossroads of the downtown of a city as big as Baltimore, around where all of the infrastructure and investment and traffic and intensity, maybe, like the more the sort of the greener, more expansive park might be appropriated in some other location. Maybe like this is the place to do kind of like the urban bulkhead and like really kind of engage the water. So I just think it's like two different approaches. And what I kind of found interesting about their three, I saw those three options, like the big water, big shade, and marsh, as kind of like three very different approaches. And they I felt like the team kind of tried to take what was best out of kind of, what kind of worked from the three of them and not kind of commit to one fully, which was, because when I look at their scheme, it still kind of looks like there's some objects around. I think that, there is a question about how much green you can fit in versus pave, but also, paving does, it is kind of conveniently accommodates like large groups of people. So I think your question is important. Are we designing for, what kinds of crowds are we designing for? Is it for everyday life? Is it for special events? Is it for like the one-offs? Which is why I kind of keep thinking like going back to having as many residents living there on the site as possible is the way to kind of ensure that you get that kind of vitality. Anyways, it is a really interesting, like high level philosophical kind of like, branch. You kind of have to commit one way or the other. And yeah, that just wanted to add
No,
that.
it's absolutely worth discussing. It won't happen just in this meeting. I hope it happens with the project team internally. I will underscore the developments that I mentioned earlier on the waterfront have a lot of residents. These are all high rises with a lot of apartments. Is it festival down on the street? No, there's not living soul. So I just wanna make sure that some of these things aren't blown out of proportion in the sense of like just assuming that it's somehow, formulaic when it's not. I think it's a little bit more, yes, there's a formula involved here, but it is also, these things are very much of the place. And I think that's that next level of complexity that I think we need to consider. Same for the green space.
Yep.
Large parks have their place. Small parks do too. Right? Yep. Anyways, I think what Kevin is attempting to do is like you're hearing a lot of variety of ideas. This isn't like you should do this. We're hoping that you engage yourselves internally and as you continue to work on the project in these discussions. And we look forward to hearing your thoughts and further development along these lines as well. Planning
Hi, thank you all for this really robust review. Just to note that we have the final presentation that will be posted to our website shortly, so that any members of the public who maybe want to go back and peruse it at their leisure can do so. And that the master plan will return to UDAAP to address the panel's comments and complete the iteration, the iterative design process at a later date. So thank you all so much.
Thank you all so much for your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.